Our story begins with those who tried to hoard supplies and hide away in residential villas. They were all wrong. Only he, having been reborn, knows the best place to survive. The fourth floor. Suddenly, he bolted upright in his seat, but the seatbelt jerked him back with a violent force. To be honest, it was quite a shock. He was gasping for air, his hand pressed firmly against the car horn. His other hand instinctively flew to cover his neck. The sharp pain of the seatbelt tightening against him was still there. It continued to gnaw at his nerves, but deep down, he knew it wasn't just the belt. It was something far more painful, the memory of a zombie. The sensation of that zombie's bite had felt far too real to be a mere trick of the mind. How could it have been so vivid? He finally let go of the horn, and the silence returned. A dream couldn't possibly feel that real, could it? He checked the time, June 20th, 1:58 in the afternoon. He remembers it perfectly. In that vision, the zombie outbreak began on June 27th, and he had been bitten on the 25th. The 25th of September, to be precise. Everything that happened in those 3 months, from June 20th until the day he was bitten, remains etched into his memory. What kind of dream has a clear beginning, an end, and lasts for 3 whole months? But more importantly, he can recall every single detail with absolute clarity. He looked up and saw the construction site of the industrial warehouse he was remodeling. The heat was becoming truly unbearable. If what he just experienced wasn't a dream, then in exactly 5 minutes, his client, who never calls him, would ring to say the payment for the construction work had finally been authorized. He would also ask to switch to the night shift to avoid this sweltering heat. So now, all Alex had to do was wait 5 minutes in total silence. To confirm it, we can imagine those were the longest 5 minutes of his life. Even the powerful air conditioning of his heavy-duty truck seemed to have completely given up on him in that moment. Thick beads of sweat began to pour from his hair and skin. The shirt he was wearing already felt completely soaked through. Deep down, he was certain that if the seat ventilation hadn't stayed on, he might have actually lost his composure entirely. When the clock hit 2:03 p.m., he felt as if a massive weight had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He told himself it was over. No more scaring himself for no reason. He wiped away the sweat and grabbed his phone to distract himself with some videos. Suddenly, the phone screen lit up in his hand. It was a call from the client. He answered it almost by pure instinct. He tried to stay calm and began to think about his next move. In any case, his absolute priority now was simply to survive. And since he had already lived through a trial version, even if only briefly, he had already learned quite a lot. The most crucial part was that his memories of those 3 months were extraordinarily vivid. Without a doubt, they would serve as an essential guide. For his survival, he started the car and headed straight home. Right now, his first step was to establish a secure base of operations. His wife happened to have the day off and was resting at home. When he arrived, he found her in the bedroom watching The Walking Dead. How appropriate, he thought. She wouldn't need to watch it much longer. In just 6 days, she would be living that experience in the flesh. Alex spent the next 40 minutes trying to prove 2 things to his wife. First, that he wasn't crazy, and second, that he had no intention of leaving or divorcing her. In the end, she remained convinced he was just a man playing a very strange joke. After all, who on earth makes up stories like these for fun? He argued that while screenwriters make a living inventing tales, he certainly wasn't the type to weave elaborate lies just to deceive her. He reminded her it was currently 3:30 p.m. and issued a specific prediction. At exactly 4 o'clock, her mother was going to call her. She would say the kitchen faucet at her house broke and that water was spraying everywhere. His wife told him to stop talking nonsense. Her mother was supposed to be at the shop all afternoon, but as it turned out, the power had gone out there and she had returned home early. Suddenly, his wife's phone began to ring. It was her mother, exactly as predicted. Alex gestured for her to answer it, a calm look on his face. She hesitated for a moment, her hand trembling slightly, before finally taking the call. And just to be sure there were no secrets, he reached over and activated the speakerphone. Her mother explained she was already home, and we see his wife's eyes widen in shock. She invited her and Alex to come over for dinner that evening. Utterly confused and perhaps a little frightened, his wife slowly hung up the phone. She stared at him, her mind racing as she tried to process what was happening. She asked him how on earth he could have known the power would go out at the shop. He told her not to worry if she still didn't believe him. There was more to come. He predicted that in another 30 minutes, her mother would call her once again. This time, the call would be to confirm that the kitchen faucet had indeed burst. Without any rush, Alex opened his laptop and logged onto a local forum. He began searching for contingency plans and survival posts to see what he could learn. Meanwhile, his wife sat there in a state of restless anxiety, waiting for the phone to ring. The clock ticked forward, and it was finally just past 4 in the afternoon. Right on cue, the call from her mother arrived with terrifying punctuality. His wife answered, and after hanging up, she stared at him and admitted he was right. She accepted that everything he said was true, even if he chose to call it a dream. She then asked the one question that truly mattered. What happened to her parents and sister? He had to tell her the truth. Her mother had died in a mahjong parlor the very day the world fell apart. As for her sister, she had been left behind on the 14th day of the collapse. Her parents had managed to hold out at home for a long time, relatively speaking. They lasted until day 55, which led her to ask the obvious question, what about her? He explained that she stayed hidden while he went out for food and was bitten, a grim memory, indeed. But this time, he was determined to ensure the entire family remained safe and sound. Upon arriving at his mother-in-law's house, he immediately set to work replacing the water valve. He also took a moment to talk with his in-laws, who had only just arrived home themselves. Now, we see them begin the daunting task of planning how to survive the coming apocalypse. His wife suggested that the safest place would obviously be their bank's vault. She noted it was incredibly sturdy, reinforced with 6 thick steel plates. She believed no one could get in, but her imagination was clearly wandering to impractical places. Alex couldn't help but chuckle, pointing out that a vault is useless if it's only good for being strong. It lacked even basic water. If they hid there, they would run out of resources almost instantly. What Alex was trying to explain was that this crisis wouldn't even be over by the end of September. He asked her how many supplies she honestly thought they could cram into such a small space. To make matters worse, he added that by the 10th day, both water and electricity would be cut off. In a sealed vault like that, they wouldn't even have enough air to breathe for long. His mother-in-law interrupted the tension, bringing a plate of fruit from the kitchen for everyone to eat. She looked at Alex, sensing that he spoke as if he had already lived through all of this before. She asked him to tell them what to do. Alex knew he now had to use all of his mental capacity to plan for his family's survival in just 1 week. Surviving the apocalypse, as we know, depends entirely on perfect timing, the right location, and the cooperation of those around you. At this very moment, time was clearly on his side. He had 7 more days than everyone else to prepare, though he had already wasted half a day. As for the location, he spent half an hour that afternoon reviewing over 100 articles about apocalyptic survival on various online forums. Almost everyone followed the same basic idea: lock yourself at home and scrape by however possible. And thinking about it carefully, that actually made quite a bit of sense. Most city dwellers are, to be honest, a bit soft and barely know where their food comes from. Perhaps some of them are capable of running a half marathon. Others might be able to perform squats with 60 kilos of weight. But when faced with the complex requirements of surviving the end of the world, they all have massive weaknesses and almost no practical strengths. Furthermore, they simply don't have the guts to go out and make a living for themselves. So, naturally, their only real option is to lock the doors and hope for the best. This strategy of hunkering down has 2 main components to consider, namely, fortifying the position and surviving on meager rations. On the internet, the idea of fortifying a home is divided into 2 main schools of thought. There is the high-rise apartment approach and the independent villa strategy. The villa school of thought is further divided into those in gated communities and those located out in the open countryside. But of course, in the end, it doesn't really matter which one you choose, as they all suffer from the inherent problems of a typical residence. A home is just a home, after all, and that brings us to disadvantage number 1. Space is tight, and the number of people who can live there is strictly limited. An apartment rarely exceeds 300 square meters, and a villa usually stops at 500. In the long run, only 3 to 5 people can realistically survive there. The need for supplies and the space to store them are inversely proportional. The more people you have, the less room there is for stockpiling essentials, making life increasingly difficult. In one particular article Alex found, they even described an incredible scenario where a family of 7 lived in a 140 square meter house, hunkered down without leaving for 2 whole years. Then there is the lack of self-sufficiency. Modern homes depend on a vast array of public utilities and can only function with constant external support. If the water or power goes out, the quality of life takes a sudden nosedive. It can even become unbearable or, worse yet, reveal your exact location. For example, in a high-rise, if the water is cut and you flush the toilet, that sound will betray your presence and suggest you still have plenty of supplies. Disadvantage number 3, defense is weak. Alex read articles suggesting one should replace standard windows with bulletproof glass or install high-resistance security doors. But honestly, has anyone actually seen how easily a window or door frame can be dismantled? He knew from experience that such things are far more fragile than they appear. Then there are those who believe a simple doorstop can fully seal a fire door. Let us consider that for a moment, a fire door, which, naturally, has its limits. Did people seriously believe these everyday fixtures were that indestructible? The 4th issue we find is that structural integrity is often quite poor. In a high-rise, you might manage, but villas come with the added complication of a yard. What is the plan then? To cover the entire space with a glass roof? If not, what happens when the zombies inevitably hop right over the fence? And would that glass roof actually hold the weight of zombies falling from above? Could it truly withstand a determined attack from someone with bad intentions? 5th on our list, the storage capacity is simply abysmal. And it isn't just a matter of having the physical space to put things. One also needs the proper facilities and access to actually transport those goods. He saw that one author had purchased 300 bags of rice and 300 of flour. Now, imagine moving all that weight. How wide is the average front door really? Can a vehicle even fit through there? How much weight can the elevator actually support? Could you fit a pallet inside? And more importantly, would the floor even hold up? How much weight can it actually support? How high can you realistically stack it all? If you truly have the strength to carry 300 sacks of rice, why stay there? Shouldn't you be out there fighting zombies instead? Now let us look at point 6. The capacity to generate one's own power is often severely limited. To prepare for the inevitable blackouts, many people realize the importance of solar energy and water purification systems, which is a good start. But many simply buy 10 square meters of solar panels and a single battery, storing 10 kilowatt hours, expecting that to run a water purifier, a refrigerator, a television, an electric blanket, a fan, and a handful of other gadgets. It is a bit optimistic, to say the least. Have they even bothered to calculate the total power they actually need? Point 7. Waste management is almost non-existent in these plans. Every article Alex read ignored the problem of packaging as if it didn't exist. But what about the actual trash and the sewage? How do you handle that? An average person produces 2 kilograms of waste. Every single day, a family of 5 would be buried in their own home within 6 months. His wife and her parents surrounded him with looks of despair. They wondered if he thought of this in 30 minutes. In truth, it had haunted his nightmares. For 3 long months, he already had a place in mind. He had already chosen the location, and he offered his wife a reassuring smile. But first, we see that they have to define exactly who will make up the team. Alex and his wife had decided not to have children, a choice that simplified things now. Her parents are still alive and healthy, which was a blessing in these circumstances. His father had already passed away, but his mother lives with them in their home. They also have a 3-year-old black Labrador, a loyal companion for the road ahead. His in-laws have a large orange cat, adding one more mouth to feed to the list. And finally, his wife has a younger sister who needs to be accounted for. She currently works as a resident doctor at the state provincial hospital in the neighboring region. So, our group consists of 5 people, 1 cat, and 1 dog. Quite a crowd. His father-in-law ran his own business years ago and is quite handy with his hands. He knows how to repair machinery, is a licensed electrician, and can even drive large trucks. Alex himself knows his way around carpentry, which would certainly come in handy. He is also skilled in masonry and welding, making him a versatile builder. If it comes down to building a simple shelter, he and his father-in-law can manage it. As long as the others lend a hand, he is certain they can raise the structure. First, he told his wife to call her sister and tell her to come back home. If she has a boyfriend, he should bring him along too. The more, the merrier. But where on earth did he think they were going to take refuge? That was the question. His name is Alex, and he is the owner of a small home remodeling company. And to be perfectly honest, he never would have imagined his career would lead to this. He never expected the work that put food on his table would one day become the very skill needed to save his life. And now, he has to use that expertise to protect his entire family in the middle of a zombie-infested apocalypse. It is June 20th, and the clock is ticking. The time is 6:40 p.m. Our story turns to their first lesson in apocalyptic survival. We see the team gathering for their very first planning meeting. They meet in his in-laws' living room, where the official attendance list for this strategy session is quite small. The group consists of his father-in-law, his mother-in-law, his wife, and Alex himself. 7 blueprints are spread across the floor, held down at the corners by shoes, glasses, and even the cat and dog, who are doing their part to keep the plans from moving. His wife diligently takes notes on her tablet as the meeting begins. On the television screen, various images are being projected for everyone to see. They show the interior and exterior of a building, while a 3D model of the construction is displayed on the laptop. Alex, using a pair of chopsticks as a makeshift pointer, begins his explanation. The objective is this building, or rather, this fortress, as he prefers to call it. It is located right on the southeast corner of a major intersection. Construction on the site originally began back in 2014. It features a reinforced concrete frame structure, cast entirely in a single, solid piece. The building stands 5 stories high, equipped with 2 freight elevators and 2 spiral staircases. Each floor offers a surface area of 830 square meters, and the roof boasts a walkable terrace of 640 square meters. Plenty of space, indeed. Its original purpose was to serve as a cold storage warehouse and office space. During its construction, the builders applied the lessons learned from the great 2008 earthquake, which is why the building's structure was intentionally reinforced far beyond the standard. The walls and floors are 20% thicker than those of a typical cold storage warehouse. This building boasts excellent seismic and impact resistance, which is quite a relief. It also offers superior thermal and acoustic insulation, making it a perfect fortress. As Alex points to the screen with his makeshift pointer to explain everything to the family, his father-in-law asks if the cold storage section of the building was ever actually finished. The old man is sharp, and he immediately catches the most critical point of the plan. If it were finished, they wouldn't have to worry about thermal or acoustic insulation at all. However, ventilation in a closed cold storage warehouse would be a serious problem, much like the issues faced in the vaults where the others are currently hiding. Furthermore, using fire inside such a sealed warehouse would be extremely dangerous. As it turns out, it isn't finished. In 2016, the main structure and the water and electrical installations were completed, but the building inspection took 2 years to be approved because, in reality, it was an illegal construction. Alex then offers to show the family some photos of the interior. He finds the corresponding photo and continues his explanation while pointing it out. In 2019, they began installing the warehouse insulation, a task that was never quite completed. They used a 50mm base of cement mortar, which provides a very solid foundation. Next, we see a 50mm layer of expanded panel insulation and a complex structure. This structure is composed of a 200mm sandwich-type insulation layer and another layer. This final layer consists of 30mm of fireproof cotton, which is quite reassuring. The cooling system ducts are tucked safely inside that sandwich-type insulation layer. The cold storage chamber is approximately 90% complete, which is nearly perfect. But just as they were about to install the ammonia cooling equipment, the pandemic hit. The company went bankrupt and the work simply stopped. A stroke of bad luck, really. So, the place is essentially a white elephant, grand, but currently useless. His mother-in-law points out it has no water or power while grabbing little Danny. The boy was trying to escape, but she pulls him back into a tight hug. But that isn't the whole story. Last year, a new energy forklift company arrived. Attracted by the local government, they took a keen interest in the building's insulation. The president of the company, a man named David, saw the potential immediately. David began making plans to revitalize the entire facility for his own needs. He looked at the reinforced walls and saw a fortress ready for his business. David knew that with a little work, the building could be functional again. He started investing in the necessary upgrades to bring the warehouse back to life. It was a bold move, but David was never one to shy away from a challenge. Slowly but surely, the abandoned project began to transform under his careful direction. And so, the stage was set for the fortress that Alex is now describing. Alex continues his explanation, though the reality of the situation is starting to set in. The setup isn't quite as ideal as it sounds, especially with the weather becoming increasingly extreme and unpredictable. He estimates that if they can even reach 20% of that capacity, they should consider themselves very lucky indeed. He extends his hands, wondering aloud just how much energy that 20% actually represents. It turns out to be 60 megawatts, but after accounting for transmission losses and the natural degradation of the panels, they are looking at approximately 40,000 kilowatt hours. He considers this for a moment. Even if they apply another 70% discount to be safe, they are still left with 12,000 kilowatt hours to work with. His father-in-law, Arthur, calculates that 30 kilowatt hours a day would be more than enough. So, their only real hurdle is storage, but that shouldn't be too difficult to manage. We see that there is a small showroom located right in front of the building. The day after tomorrow, they are scheduled to receive 5 sets of high-capacity car batteries, along with 10 additional battery modules for the system. In total, they will be able to store 950 kilowatt hours. But if they have all that storage, he wonders what the actual power output would be. The car battery packs can provide 6 kilowatts of power. The smaller battery modules provide 1 kilowatt each. They can be used in groups, charging and discharging them in shifts to keep things running. Everyone nods in agreement, and for the first time, we can feel a collective sigh of relief. At this point, they finally had a reliable source of electricity. They also had a way to store it, which was a relief. The next step was figuring out how to use it throughout the entire building. If storage ran low, they could rely on the main lighting system, which was designed for 400 kilowatts. In theory, that should have been more than enough for their needs. However, Alex scratched his head, realizing it was practically impossible to use. The pre-installed electrical system, including the heavy-duty power lines, the standard lighting, and the low-voltage circuits. The reason was quite simple: the noise and the inevitable equipment wear. We see him change the display to an aerial view of the factory. The fortress's transformer, following national regulations, is located in an open area near the perimeter fence, right next to the electrical control room. Furthermore, since this is an industrial warehouse, all the lamps are high power and explosion-proof. They provide a massive amount of light, certainly, but they also consume a staggering amount of electricity. To make matters worse, these lamps have their own cooling systems, meaning the current electrical setup would create constant noise from the transformer. Using the existing system would mean dealing with humming transformers, loud lamps, and rapid mechanical wear. And in this world, noise is an invitation for zombies and desperate strangers alike. And if the equipment breaks down, they simply don't have the capacity to repair it. His father-in-law, Mike, paused for a moment to think before speaking up. He suggested that since they had enough capacity to generate and store power, they might as well build their own independent electrical system from scratch. The plan was to generate power with solar panels, run it through a charger, and then straight into the high-capacity blade battery packs from the cars. From there, they could use the 6-kilowatt external discharge from the battery packs to provide electricity. Alex noted they would need to find automatic timer switches to ensure all the battery packs were being used in a balanced, efficient way. Alex added this detail quickly, and Mike nodded in agreement. His wife, Sophie, gave him a small signal to show she had already noted it down. It was a solid plan. They currently had 5 full sets of batteries to work with. They decided on a combination of 2 pairs, leaving one set as a backup. As long as they monitored the simultaneous consumption so it didn't exceed 10 kilowatts, the power supply would remain safe and perfectly stable. With that settled, the electricity problem was finally off the list. Next on the agenda was water, a problem that had to be divided into 3 parts: collection, storage, and drainage. A simple enough list, in theory. They started by focusing on the first 2, collection and storage. We should remember that water and power were cut off just 10 days after the outbreak. As Alex explained the project, he felt completely in his element, like a fish in water. 13 days passed from the moment the water was cut off until the heavy rains finally began. After 7 days of intense rainfall, they were faced with a grueling period of 46 days, without a single drop of rain. In other words, they needed to store water for at least 60 days. Considering the family's current consumption, they would need a staggering 43 tons of water. It was an incredibly high figure, not to mention the sheer physical size required for a 40-ton tank. To be honest, the floor likely wasn't built to handle that kind of weight. It wouldn't hold up, would it? So, they had to do everything possible to save water and use it in stages. And, of course, they would have to recycle every drop. Mike suggested that Sophie and her mother should spend the night thinking it over. They needed to find practical ways to save water during their daily routines. His father-in-law gave the final order, and Sophie nodded in quiet, dutiful agreement. Alex knew that if he had been the one to ask, she probably would have just ignored him. Inside the building, we see there are 2 5-ton tanks already in place. They used to provide plenty of purified water for the facility's production needs. The purification equipment had more than enough capacity, but it was located on the first floor. Alex planned to remove some parts and hide them in the cold storage area, so it would look like the purification system was broken. He took a sip of water, satisfied with the deception. A few days earlier, he had discovered a well in the garden on the south side of the building. It was a pumping well, and fortunately, it already had the necessary piping installed. The water outlet is cleverly hidden inside the well, with a discharge point located on the second floor. By installing a small 50-meter pump, we can easily draw the water out. The previous company likely wanted to use groundwater in secret to cool their equipment. Alex managed to get the test blueprints and carefully marked the location of every pipe. He planned to completely seal off the pipe shaft on the first and second floors and extend the piping all the way up to the 4th floor. For their drinking supply, they would use purified water, requiring a separate filtration system. He also needed to install ultraviolet disinfection lamps in both water tanks to ensure the water could be sterilized at any given moment. Finally, we come to the matter of waste disposal. To be honest, this was a truly massive problem to solve. A single person produces about 2 kilograms of waste every day. It was a reality that simply couldn't be ignored, no matter how unpleasant. Solid and liquid waste had to be kept entirely separate from the domestic gray water. For personal needs, they would use a portable camping toilet equipped with biodegradable liquid. They would double the number of blackwater tanks and empty them all at once, but only when it was finally safe to do so. The sewage pipe would only be used within the sealed shaft, utilizing a pipe from the shaft on the opposite side to keep everything dry. He gave the dog a gentle nudge to move it, as its rear was right over the pipe shaft. Domestic gray water is divided into 2 categories, as some of it contains oils. This will be collected in a tank where the oil is filtered out using a separator. The waste is gathered in a specific tank for collection, while the remaining water is processed together. On rainy days, we see them secretly discharging the excess into the municipal drainage system. He tossed a biscuit to the little dog to keep it quiet and calm. The key to waste disposal is maintaining absolute stealth and silence throughout the entire process. In addition to saving as much water as possible, this, combined with water recycling, would reduce the total amount of wastewater to an absolute minimum. And so, they would significantly reduce the risk of ever being discovered. His father-in-law, ever the cautious man, asked if the 2 drainage pipes were connected. They were not. Even the septic tank had been designed with 2 separate compartments. When sealing the wellhead, they realized it had to be filled with expanding foam. They had to find a way to prevent the sound of water from echoing inside. It seemed his father-in-law really did think of everything, which was quite impressive. He truly had to take his hat off to the man. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. His mother arrived, and we see her walking in with some desserts she had bought. His mother-in-law gave herself a light slap on the forehead in realization. With all the talking, she had completely forgotten that they hadn't eaten yet. She hurried to the kitchen, took the food out of the oven, and set the table. She called everyone over to eat, suggesting they continue their talk over a meal. His mother was utterly confused, wondering what on earth they were all plotting together. She noted they hadn't even found time to eat. His wife, Sarah, tried to explain the situation, but Mark stopped her immediately. It was nothing, he insisted. He mentioned that summer was almost here and suggested they should all go on a vacation together. It was a wonderful idea, or so it seemed at the moment. Pick a place with your parents, he said. He told her to listen closely to their opinions while making the plans. They hadn't decided on a destination yet, but he told her not to worry about a thing. He promised to handle everything himself. Then, his mother turned to Sarah with a question. She suggested inviting Sarah's sister along so she could join the family trip as well. Sarah agreed naturally. His mother, seeing that the food was finally served, felt her work was done. She said a quick goodbye to his mother-in-law and headed off to her Zumba class. Sarah remained behind, looking quite confused by the sudden change in topic. She asked him why he hadn't just told his mother the truth about their secret preparations. He reminded her that his mother had been a dedicated public servant for 50 years. Some things were better left unsaid. He sat down, picked up a roll, and began to eat as if nothing were wrong. Suddenly, the phone resting on the sofa began to ring, breaking the silence. It was a message. Sarah practically jumped over to the sofa to pick it up. She teased him, asking who could possibly be sending him a message at this hour. He held his roll and let out a small, nervous sound. To be honest, he wasn't expecting an audience. She jokingly asked if he was afraid she might see a secret message from a little friend. Mark popped a piece of bacon into his mouth and took a satisfying bite. The savory juices from the meat burst forth instantly. A thick, rich sauce flooded his mouth without warning. The warm juice carried with it a subtle, toasted aroma. The flavor of the Maillard reaction is truly addictive, and who could blame him for enjoying it? He savored that first bite, letting himself get lost in the scent. He let out a long sigh, feeling completely relaxed for the first time all day. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing scream erupted from his wife, Sarah. He whipped his head around as she shoved the phone directly into his face. The screen was so close it occupied his entire field of vision. It was from an unknown number, and the message was chilling. "I know what you're doing." It was as if time itself had ground to a halt. Only the notification light on the phone, blinking with the arrival of the message, seemed to prove that the world was still turning. Our protagonist is Mark, an accountant who, ironically, has never actually worked as one. He graduated with a degree in accounting, but now the figures he has to calculate are different. He is calculating how his family will survive the end of the world. If he gets the math right, there is still no guarantee they will live. But if he gets it wrong, they are almost certainly doomed. He slowly swallowed the food in his mouth, the flavor now forgotten. And so, the countdown begins. 5, 4, 3, 2. The phone screen lights up once again, cutting through the tension. An incoming call appears, and it is that same unknown number. Sarah tosses the phone onto the table and spins around, checking if someone is inside the house. The screen flashes again as the call persists, and Sarah grips Mark's leg with all her strength. He decides to answer the call, immediately switching it to speakerphone. A girl's voice comes through, sounding remarkably clear and cheerful. She asks how the scare went, laughing as she wonders if they were truly terrified. She laughs again, noting that while she wasn't scared, his sister was frightened to death. Mark is baffled, wondering how this is possible since he had sent his sister a message. He told her he changed his number, but the girl tells him to check his phone. She asks if he really didn't notice that his mobile data wasn't even turned on. He wasn't even connected to the Wi-Fi, which, naturally, leaves him completely bewildered. The girl announces she is leaving and warns him he'd better make things right with his sister. She promises to call tomorrow, and then the line goes dead with a series of beeps. Mark shows the phone to Sarah, who is still processing the sudden shift in tone. The call is over, but Sarah's hands are shaking from a mix of fear and growing anger. She declares the girl is crazy and insists that Mark must go pick her up tomorrow. She wants her to write a prescription and a list for a home first aid kit. She tells him to buy 20 of them and bring them back, and he simply agrees. As for why they should buy them there, it's because she is currently in another state. She explains that by doing this, they are far less likely to attract any unwanted attention. Mark adds, speaking through gritted teeth, that he has reached his limit with this situation. He is convinced that the bratty girl needs to be taught a serious lesson for her games. The family finishes their dinner quickly, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of their plans. We find them once again sprawled out on the living room floor, continuing their research together. His father-in-law, holding a glass in his hand, begins to speak slowly and deliberately. He points out that waste disposal in their situation is not nearly as simple as it seems. While solid waste is relatively easy to manage, it still requires a very specific process. With the correct dose of a decomposing agent, the remaining residue becomes quite minimal. Everything goes into the septic tank, which, naturally, must be kept very well hidden from view. They must prevent anyone with bad intentions from realizing that the system is actually being used. In fact, they shouldn't even consider cleaning it out for the next several years. According to the design specifications, the planned cleaning cycle for this particular tank is 12 months, though that is based on a much larger standard of 30 years. The tank is built to serve 200 people, and our group currently consists of only 6. This means they wouldn't have to worry about cleaning it for another 30 years, a small relief. His mother-in-law does a quick calculation, pointing toward the family cat and the dog. The dog isn't an issue, as a decomposing agent can be used for its waste as well. Mark gently pushes the dog away as it approaches him, noting that the cat is more complicated. While cat waste decomposes, not all types of litter are compatible with their system. The dog's situation is slightly more complex, as while its waste can be decomposed, not every type of litter is compatible. To be honest, the logistics are becoming quite a headache. And then there is the cat, a 10-kilogram beast with the undeniable aura of a general. He glances sideways with pure laziness at the group of 2-legged slaves who are currently staring at him intently while he goes about his private business. He makes a face of utter disdain, completing his ritual as if nothing else in the world mattered. After shaking out his paws, he leaps onto the sofa and settles in comfortably. His mother-in-law suggests in a low voice that if they can find biodegradable litter, they should take Juso with them. Mark takes a long look at Juso, who seems entirely unconcerned with the conversation. There he is, happily licking his paws without even bothering to glance in Mark's direction. Mark turns away and grits his teeth, deciding it is time to contact his friends for help. He needs to see if they can track down the specific cat litter required for their system. If they find it, the cat comes along. If not, the plan changes. The only other option would be to leave him at home with plenty of food and water. He would simply have to manage on his own, a harsh reality, to be sure. Just as he finishes saying that, he feels a sharp gaze coming from the sofa. He jumps slightly and turns around to find Juso watching him intently. The cat simply continues licking his paws, looking perfectly calm and perhaps a bit judgmental. After addressing the issue of wastewater, we move on to the next critical point. The conversation shifts toward the difficult task of solid waste disposal. This is a problem for which Mark has yet to find a solution, even after scouring nearly 100 articles and endless forum threads. The issue is that most people, when reading these survival guides, love to stockpile pre-packaged meals, snacks, and bottled water. Based on a 10-to-1 packaging ratio for most food products, and an expansion ratio of 3-to-1 once opened, anyone hoarding over 150 cubic meters of supplies will find themselves surrounded by over 3 cubic meters of plastic bags in a year. And we know plastic bags won't simply stay still or remain tidy. They certainly won't stay organized, not to mention the food scraps that inevitably remain in the packaging. Juices will rot and everything will spoil. By then, perhaps even the zombies wouldn't want to step foot in that room. It is, quite frankly, impossible to avoid generating waste entirely. At the very least, when stockpiling provisions, the packaging is unavoidable. As the time in lockdown stretches on and the supplies are consumed, the pile of solid waste will only continue to grow. These are facts that simply cannot be ignored, nor can the trash just be thrown out whenever one feels like it. The first option would destroy the shelter's living environment, and the second would not only attract zombies, but likely other people as well. This is a problem with bad intentions lurking behind it. The solution has two parts, and it must be addressed from both the source and the treatment of the waste. Mark shook the Coca-Cola in his hand so everyone could see it clearly. Regarding the packaging of the supplies we store, we must avoid certain things at all costs, specifically items like bottles, cans, and heavy barrels. That is to say, packaging with fixed volumes made of glass, metal, or ceramic. So, does this mean he's giving up on Coca-Cola? Not quite. For that, one simply needs to have some 2.5-liter steel cylinders of carbon dioxide ready and waiting. You combine that with cola syrup, and just like that, you have fresh soda. Plus, they can serve as emergency fire extinguishers or even weapons. Quite versatile, really. Furthermore, producing carbon dioxide with baking soda is a massive benefit. Using baking soda and citric acid is a remarkably simple process. It's no challenge at all for an accountant with a food specialty like Mark. Now, for the waste treatment, we see that he's going to need 2 small machines. Let's take a look at the image he's showing us. The one on the left is a small, low-speed, vertical, single-shaft shredder. Its dimensions are 60 centimeters by 46 centimeters by 122 centimeters. The size of what it can shred shouldn't exceed 40 centimeters. It can shred paper, plastic, thin-walled metals, and even textiles with ease. The maximum size of the shredded material is a mere 3 millimeters. Mark held up a soybean to give us a sense of the scale. The machine on the right is a twin-screw plate compactor with 28 tons of pressure. Using a mold, he can take the plastic from the shredder and compress it into blocks, measuring 15 by 20 centimeters, which can be stacked quite neatly. The motor power for both of these machines is 4.8 kilowatts. He pulled the blueprints closer and pointed to a corner on the 4th floor. This is where the owner planned to install the bag filter and the electrostatic precipitator. It's a small room with a few office chairs, making it an ideal spare parts warehouse. That's where they'll store the compressed blocks and install 5 or 6 15-watt ultraviolet ozone lamps to keep the entire room properly sanitized. The shredder's power remains at 4.8 kilowatts, a consistent choice, really. The Lyasa brand is considered one of the top-tier options in this field. After doing the math, he realized that for the 6 of them, they generate about 0.2 cubic meters of solid waste per month. But what about maintaining all this equipment? We might wonder. It's a completely mechanical structure, almost entirely devoid of fragile electronic boards. And it doesn't have any parts that are prone to wearing out quickly. They are pure metallic materials, built for heavy-duty use and nothing less. The threaded rods are standard, and the specialized parts are just solid pieces of metal that are almost impossible to break. Therefore, having a good stock of motors is the real priority. Fortunately, Mark's father-in-law is quite the expert when it comes to mechanics. He made sure to set aside 4 sets of seals and various hardware. The motors for both machines are interchangeable, which is a clever bit of planning. They even serve as backups for the motor on the Yangqing pump. In addition, he decided they should keep 2 more spare motors on hand, just in case. One might wonder if all that metal clanking together would create a deafening noise. Not really, as he specifically chose low-speed equipment for this very reason. While they take longer to finish the job, they operate much more quietly. The operating noise sits at about 70 or 80 decibels, perfectly manageable. His father-in-law is very satisfied, so they decide to build a small shed. Out of plywood, they'll add some acoustic insulation and the job will be done. Finally, we come to the matter of waste disposal. This part of the plan is, relatively speaking, the simplest of all. In the building, the third and fifth floors were originally designed for storage. They were completely finished cold rooms, ready for use. The cold room on the fourth floor, however, was missing one corner to be fully complete. Now, that specific spot is where the dust collection equipment is located, housing both the bag filter and the electrostatic precipitator. The third, fourth, and fifth floors have ducts that can be connected right here. And on the inside, they are fitted with panels to dampen the noise. Ventilation and soundproofing are no longer a concern for the entire dust collection system. The section facing the exterior is the electrostatic precipitation tunnel. The tunnel features dozens of layers of metal mesh designed to trap every speck of dust. Although they call them meshes, they are actually more like grid plates. These are 5mm thick metal sheets, perforated with various sizes to allow the air to flow through. It would be nearly impossible to break through this grid, especially since the tunnel is barely 40 centimeters in diameter. One might wonder how Mark knows this place so well. His mother-in-law finally asked the question on everyone's mind. The answer was simple. This was his project. After the owner took over this abandoned cold room, he chose Mark's team, insisting they handle the entire job, including the workshop and offices. He was responsible for the decoration and the final finishes of the production area. But a problem remained. How would he explain their presence to the owner once they moved in? There are 13 people in total, for locals, and 9 from out of town. Tonight, they are all scheduled to have dinner together. And as fate would have it, one of them is going to test positive for COVID. By tomorrow, everyone will be quarantined at home until the zombie apocalypse officially begins. They will be watched through the security cameras, though the indoor cameras are another story. The cameras outside the building are already installed, but they haven't been handed over to the owner yet. So that shouldn't be much of a problem. The industrial park cameras, however, have already been turned over to the owner, but they won't be able to see what we're doing inside the building. And then there was the most important detail, which brought a slight smile to Mark's face. The owner had already deposited 70% of the funds. He had already received 70% of the project payment, exactly as they had agreed. And the deadline to pay the suppliers hadn't even arrived yet. At this very moment, he was sitting on $3.8 million in cash, and he could still order another entire batch of supplies on credit. Well, it's safe to say they could now do whatever they wanted with this building. So what was the plan for the space? The building has 5 floors in total. The first floor houses the loading dock and the water purification equipment room. The first floor is the loading dock and the water purification room, currently filled with construction debris. They were going to leave it exactly as it was, messy and uninviting. This would confuse the owner and maintain the charade that the project had been abandoned. The second floor consists of the office area and the main showroom. Right now, all the raw materials are piled up there, and they have no intention of moving them. Again, this was all to maintain the appearance of a deserted construction site. As for the stairs leading from the second floor up to the third, they had already blocked them with a heavy stainless steel door that was, quite literally, immovable. The first step involves the wall. We see that the wall can actually be moved using the wooden planks. They only need to weld some reinforcing rods and join it to the steel structure of the staircase to make it a single, solid piece. This way, the zombies won't be able to climb up. Meanwhile, the cold rooms on the third and fifth floors are already finished, though they have no intention of using them. On one hand, this is a clever trick to confuse any potential intruders. Since the third and fifth floors have no windows, Mark recalled how he got confused the first time he entered, losing track of which floor he was on. By modifying the space, he managed to break down the supplies once more. He organized the oil packs and the silver again to keep the vessels in constant motion. It was as if the usual spatial rules didn't apply within those 30 meters, leaving everything feeling slightly displaced. Is there another structure on the fourth floor? Mark realized his father-in-law was a genius. With just a few words, the old man had hit the nail right on the head. The original owner had planned to build a laboratory on the third floor, one of those specialized facilities that require total acoustic isolation. To achieve this, he used a prefabricated soundproof room. A prefabricated soundproof room is exactly what it sounds like, a fortress of silence. It is a modular construction with a significant level of acoustic insulation in the walls, the floor, and the ceiling. Everything is manufactured at the plant and then assembled right here. It even comes with everything integrated: doors, windows, water installations, electricity, and so on. He wondered if there were divisions within those 200 square meters. And more importantly, would they need a crane to install the roof? As it turns out, no crane is needed. The panel joints are structural pieces themselves. Once the floor and walls are mounted, the roof can be lifted directly through the doors. Mark then showed the installation video to his father-in-law. We see that the structure already has several divisions built in. There is a transition room and 2 smaller dressing rooms, which altogether add up to 20 square meters. In addition, there are 3 other rooms of 20 square meters each, distributed along the sides, leaving a 120-meter hall in the center. He asked himself if they would need to build another room for little Bella, but there was no need for that. They only had to remove a partition. The structure has several divisions, including a transition room and 2 small dressing rooms. With the walls they removed, they could easily set up a bathroom in the main hall. As for the kitchen, he figured they wouldn't be cooking very elaborate dishes later on. At least not the kind that require high-heat stir-frying. Those methods generate far too much smoke and noise. The air fryer and the steam oven would become their primary tools for cooking in the new space. Mark realized this would save him a significant amount of work. His mother-in-law smiled faintly, noting that the problem of washing dishes remained unsolved. In this day and age, we all rely on dishwashers, after all. And his wife reminded him that he was strictly against using disposables. She always knew exactly how to joke about the heart of the problem. Because, let's be honest, who actually wants to wash dishes? The dishwasher had to work. He jokingly claimed he couldn't even remember how to wash them by hand anymore. Besides, a dishwasher uses far less water than manual scrubbing, a vital point for them. It was essential, and they were certain they could find a spot for it. The dishwasher was non-negotiable. He immediately pointed out that they already had water and power. They only needed a small pressure pump to guarantee the water pressure required for the machine to run. And just like that, it was settled, even if he didn't know much about electricity. He wanted to see how to connect the 220-volt output from the battery bank to the living area. We see that they have 5 battery banks at their disposal. The plan was to use them in 2 distinct groups of 2. Each week, the spare bank would be rotated into the system to keep things fresh. With this constant rotation, he began to wonder exactly which components they would need. His father-in-law picked up a pen and immediately began running the numbers. He envisioned a 60-amp distribution cabinet with a 3-level switch group. At the output, we wait for quite a while, but the old man remains lost in his calculations. It was already past 10, so Mark and his wife decided to head home for the night. After all, the goal for today was simply to reach an agreement, and along the way, they had managed to plan so much more. It was far more than he had ever expected. The next day, his wife had to pick up her sister while Mark needed to buy supplies at the factory, so it was best to get some rest early. His in-laws live on the 6th floor of the building. Suddenly, it occurred to him to suggest that they take the stairs instead. In the future, he reasoned, there wouldn't be any elevators left to use anyway. And so, they began their long descent down the stairwell. In modern high-rises, we see that stairs are basically reserved for emergencies. Normally, aside from the cleaning and maintenance crews, almost no one uses them. Furthermore, the stairwell itself was tucked away in a dark corner. Hardly any light filtered in from outside, and the lamps were already quite old. They flickered incessantly. With that, the atmosphere quickly became perfect for a suspense movie. He tried to play a joke on his wife, but she completely ignored him. He scratched his nose, feeling a bit awkward, which, to be honest, was understandable. By the time they reached the 2nd floor, there wasn't a single window left. There was only a small ceiling lamp that flickered every now and then. To be honest, we see that they had never actually used these stairs before. The place looked identical to the cold, sterile stairwell of a meat locker. Mark couldn't help himself and tried to joke with his wife once again. But as he looked down, well, he was in for a surprise. He wondered just when their dog, Buster, had managed to slip out. He reached out to pick him up, and Buster hopped right into his arms. He told the dog he'd carry him to the 1st floor and then take the elevator back up. As they rounded the corner of the final flight of stairs, they saw the fire door. It was supposed to be a safety barrier, but something was very wrong. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed through the narrow space. It was a sharp, harrowing sound, as if someone were stretching their vocal cords to the absolute limit, trying to squeeze out every last drop of sound. The monsters had arrived. They were here much earlier than he expected. With a deafening boom, the emergency door was violently forced open. They began to pour in one by one, completely covered in blood. Raw, mangled faces twisted behind the metal gate, screaming in hunger. Countless hands reached through the bars, desperately trying to grab them. Suddenly, he was hit by a foul gust of wind smelling of rot and decay. It was enough to make anyone gag, but luckily, he had already stepped back. And that was how he narrowly avoided being grabbed by the zombies. He scrambled up the stairs, putting a few steps of distance between them. Seeing that the metal gate was firmly holding the monsters back, he breathed a small sigh of relief. He hurried back up the steps, reaching out to pull his wife to safety. They had to move fast. They needed to get back and warn their parents immediately. But he didn't quite manage to catch her hand in time. Instead, she simply raised her finger and pointed right behind him. He turned around, and what he saw in that moment made his blood run cold. A few zombie rats, almost entirely hairless, were struggling to climb over the other monsters. To get past the gate, the one in the lead was already tumbling toward the floor. He felt a wave of dread. He hadn't seen anything like this in the trial version. He desperately tried to think of a way to defend against something as small as a rat. To be honest, their physical state didn't seem to exceed the agility of a normal rat. The problem, however, was that they were using the larger zombies as a bridge to climb. Right over the barriers, one of the zombie rats had already hit the ground. It was now scurrying at full speed toward the stairs where they stood. Despair finally took hold of him. Feeling completely helpless, he simply closed his eyes. Suddenly, the soft sound of a cat's meow echoed through the stairwell. In an instant, the guttural growls of the zombies seemed to vanish into thin air. He snapped his eyes open, only to find that everything was suddenly bathed in light. We find him sitting on the sofa, with his cat, Jasper, curled up in his lap. He wasn't sure how long he'd been there. His father-in-law sat nearby, sketching quietly at the table, while his wife watched him with a look of concern. He asked her what time it was. It was just after 8:30. He was surprised it was still so early. She explained that he had asked her father to calculate the materials they needed, and then he'd simply drifted off. He had only been asleep for 5 minutes before waking up again. He looked down at Jasper. Seeing that his human was finally awake, the cat lifted his head, stretched his small body, and hopped down from his lap. The cat sauntered away, and for some reason, he thought he saw a hint of arrogance in that walk, which, naturally, is just how cats are. Meanwhile, his father-in-law had finished the list of materials. He quickly took a photo of it and sent it to the electronics store he usually worked with. He left them a message, asking them to prepare double the usual amount of supplies. He told them he would be there first thing in the morning to pick everything up. After that, he turned to speak with his father-in-law about their defenses. He had been thinking about the barrier between the second and third floors. Deep down, he was certain that a simple metal gate wouldn't be enough to keep them safe. He worried about smaller creatures, like rats or even cockroaches, getting through. If they turned into monsters, he feared they would have no way of stopping them. He asked for the older man's opinion, but it was his wife who provided the solution. She suggested they use the reinforced armored glass from their bank. A brilliant idea, really. Her idea was to use it like a wall, sealing off the entire stairwell corridor. But as we see, it wasn't exactly realistic. The production cycle for hardening normal glass takes about 5 days, and that's just for standard 10mm tempered glass. He found himself giving his wife a brief, albeit necessary, lesson on glass manufacturing. If they wanted the 30mm multi-layered laminated glass used in bank windows, the production cycle would jump to 15 or even 20 days, and that was without even considering that they lacked the necessary permits, leaving it quite uncertain if they could even buy it in the first place. Furthermore, installing tempered glass requires a specialized frame. The size of the glass and the density of the frame are inversely proportional. The smaller the glass panes, the denser and heavier the frame must be. This meant more connection points between the frame, the floor, the walls, and the ceiling. The total weight is immense, and if not installed perfectly, the entire glass partition could actually collapse under its own weight. This is why he felt those survival articles claiming you can order custom glass just days before an outbreak are completely wrong. It is, quite simply, impossible. The tempering furnace wouldn't even have enough time to heat up and cool down. Besides, if someone with bad intentions showed up, they could just dismantle the frame. The method is simple. A large sledgehammer or a small mallet would do the trick. He wasn't trying to fool anyone. If they truly wanted to block the path, to block the stairs, we could do this. If the frame is 10mm, the floor must match. With a frame of that size, he explained, they would need to pour a solid concrete containment block. Fortunately, the previous owner had already requested a complete overhaul of the cement work, including the mortar base and the self-leveling compound for the second floor. This meant the sand, gravel, and cement were already sitting right there on the second floor. It would be a complete waste not to put those materials to good use, wouldn't it? He calculated that since the first zombie in the complex appeared on the 28th, which was noon on the second day after the outbreak, their timeline was tight but manageable. We see they have plenty of time during the night of the 27th, the day it all begins, to fill the stairwell gap with concrete, along with the service shafts and electrical ducts. He also planned to use a staggered sealing method to ensure maximum security. In other words, the water and power lines they actually used would be sealed on floors 1, 2, and 3. As for the 5th floor ducts that would remain unused, he decided to seal floors 3, 4, and 5. It was a meticulous plan, designed to leave absolutely no room for error. The elevator would also be dealt with, specifically on the 4th floor. They would install a kill switch on the elevator circuit so no one else could ever operate it. This would completely block any route from the other floors toward the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. He reminded himself to either destroy the elevator control panel or track down the manufacturer to purchase a specific spare part for their own future use. His father-in-law admitted he didn't understand a word, prompting a playful sigh at the silly boy. When people step into the elevator and see 5 buttons, who would ever suspect there are only 4 floors? The old man couldn't help but admire how clever the plan was. After doing some research, Alex discovered it was a locally manufactured elevator. He tracked down the local supplier's number and gave them a call immediately. He explained that there was one specific floor he wanted to keep restricted from the public. The person on the other end of the line was surprisingly understanding about the request. They assumed he was running a private club or a spa, which made sense to them. The supplier assured him that what he was asking for was actually quite simple. They already had a ready-made solution for exactly that kind of security situation. He could replace the floor button with a call button that required a specific action. The user would have to hold it down in a very particular way to activate it. Alternatively, they could program the other floor buttons to act as a secret passcode. Since this bypassed standard regulations, he would have to pick it up and install it himself. To be honest, this was even more perfect than he had originally imagined. Preferring that no strangers visit the site, he ordered 2 control panels without a second thought. He arranged to go and collect them personally the following day at noon. Finally, we see him turn his attention to the layout of the storage area. Unlike others who might simply stack cardboard boxes directly on the cold floor, He chose to use heavy-duty loading pallets. The primary advantage of storing supplies on pallets is that they remain organized and remarkably easy to transport. With this setup, the forklift can move the entire load of goods in a single trip. A standard plastic pallet measuring 1.5 by 1.2 meters is quite a sturdy thing. It can support a static load of up to 1 ton and can be stacked up to 1.6 meters high. That amounts to roughly 2.83 cubic meters of storage space per unit. Within the 400-meter storage area, he planned to use these 1.5 by 1.2 meter pallets. Since there was no need to leave room for large vehicles, he realized he could be efficient. The aisles could be reduced to just 1 meter wide to maximize every inch. By organizing the rows and leaving just enough room to maneuver, he could fit 180 pallets. If he used a quarter of the remaining warehouse space for a different purpose, he could use the second floorboards to build hydroponic growing boxes for a steady food supply. This way, we see he would always have fresh vegetables. Along the edge of the living area, he could install continuous shelving, totaling about 60 meters in length. Each 1.6 meter plastic pallet setup consists of 4 levels and stands 1.6 meters tall. It would be easy to reach his supplies while still storing a massive amount of inventory. The only question remaining was whether the shelves and pallets were actually in stock. Fortunately, they were. The factory was located just 2 kilometers from the cold storage warehouse. He had purchased from them before, and after a quick visit that afternoon, he saw they had plenty. Without a moment's hesitation, he placed the order immediately. He bought nearly their entire inventory that afternoon and even managed to secure a discount. Furthermore, he paid a 50% deposit, leaving the rest to be settled in 30 days. Now, we might wonder how one could possibly grow crops without sunlight inside a warehouse. The answer, of course, lay in using full-spectrum LED grow lights. For an area of 100 square meters, he calculated he would need about 8 kilowatts. They might not grow quite as well as they would under perfectly tuned lighting, he admitted, but at the very least, there would be a harvest of some kind. As he sat there, he began to turn over everything that still needed to be done. He realized that, for the most part, all that remained was the actual execution of the plan. The layout for their new home was finished. The planning stage was finally over. After discussing it with his wife, Sarah, they both prepared to head back home. Before they left, she was still giving her mother a few last-minute instructions. She asked her to start packing up the clothes and other essentials. Meanwhile, he couldn't take his eyes off their dog, Buster. The dog, for his part, didn't seem to have a single care in the world. He was just lying there, completely relaxed with his paws crossed. Watching him, he gently reminded his mother-in-law to stay focused. He made sure she remembered to pack all of Buster's things as well. The plan was to take everything over to the new location all at once. At the mention of his name, Buster's tail began to wag with unmistakable joy. The next morning, the very first thing he did upon waking was check the news app. It was June 21st, around 6:30 in the morning, and the countdown had truly begun. We see the news breaking. A U.S. military F-35 fighter jet has crashed in Japan. The disaster occurred shortly after the pilot managed to eject from the aircraft. It fell directly onto the Manhwa nuclear plant, striking the reactor's containment dome. The impact caused immediate chaos, leaving a staggering number of victims in its wake. At the same time, the breach released an enormous and terrifying amount of radiation. Deep down, he suspected this very event was the catalyst for the zombie outbreak. By 6:32, the top trending topic on social media had shifted rapidly. The world was now watching as a U.S. military plane crashed into a Japanese nuclear plant. He sighed and turned off the screen, knowing that whatever must happen will happen. In the end, he realized, a person truly has to look out for themselves. Our protagonist, Jack, had spent his university years studying food science. Through a twist of fate, he ended up in the decoration industry instead of becoming a great scientist. However, he planned to use his food knowledge and contacts to secure his family's survival. With the plan in motion, he went to wake up his wife, Sarah. She and her sister had already discussed the situation over the phone the previous day. The suggestion that they all head out together for a trip was accepted immediately. They had even used the late-night hours to prepare a comprehensive grocery list. The necessary funds had already been transferred directly to Sarah's phone. His mother joined them as well, and the three of them shared a quick breakfast. After that, they divided the tasks among themselves, with Jack taking the lead, of course. Jack decided he would take charge of securing all the necessary supplies right here in the city. His wife, Sarah, would take the car to go pick up her sister. But first, of course, she had to stop and buy medicine using the electronic prescription. His mother, as she always did, went off to enjoy a walk on her own. To be honest, Jack had very specific reasons for not involving his mother in the preparations. First of all, the lady was already over 70 years old. Furthermore, she didn't really have much to do. And secondly, there was her social life. His mother was used to being out and about everywhere and had a vast circle of friends. If she suddenly saw the whole family looking so busy, she would undoubtedly suspect something. Her friends would surely notice the change, and information like that leaks out quite easily. Thirdly, there was the matter of her husband, who had served the town for 50 years. His loyalty to the people was as clear and evident as the morning sun. The moment he learned of the situation, he would almost certainly report it to the authorities. Regardless of whether his report worked, it would definitely interfere with their private preparations. Jack then turned his attention to his father's colleague and his impressive vehicle. That man's car was significantly larger than their own modest Viva D10 model. It was comfortable to drive, and, more importantly, it could hold a massive amount of gear. He eyed the colleague's hybrid car, noting that a full tank could cover over 300 kilometers. He reminded Sarah that since she was heading to her sister's, she should stop by her father's station. The fuel there was cheaper, so she was to fill the tank and buy 4 40-liter canisters of gasoline. He told her to fill them up and hide them beneath everything else she bought. And while she was at it, she should grab whatever food she felt like eating. Because, as we know, there wouldn't be another chance later. Once he saw them off, Jack immediately began taking care of his own pressing business. First, he went to order the electrical materials and the control panel for the elevator. For the elevator panel, he chose a system requiring both a password and verification. He even added a combined method that required specific hardware authorization. The elevator technician watched him with a great deal of curiosity. Seeing Jack choose the most complex system, the man quietly asked for the address. He wondered why there was such a fuss. Jack just smiled and said it was for a friend, one of those guys who knows how to fight for real. He even asked the technician if he wanted to go take a look that night. The man turned pale with fright. After that, Jack headed over to the grain company. The moment he arrived at the grain company, he found himself surrounded by various grain samples. At the exact moment he stepped into the grain company's office, he encountered a large group of suppliers and their products. Wondered why there was so much commotion. Everyone seemed to be asking what the fuss was about. The moment he arrived at the grain company, he was met by a group of wholesalers. Jack wondered why there was such a massive commotion. The moment he arrived at the grain company's headquarters, he found himself surrounded by a vast array of grain samples. Again, he couldn't help but wonder why everyone was making such a fuss. As he navigated the crowd at the grain company, he realized he had come to the provincial capital for 2 very specific reasons. The first was to help out a friend who was in a bit of a tight spot, and he found himself standing before a massive 40-foot trailer. He had specifically asked to provide his friend with a 40-foot container full of supplies. This would allow him to transport all the goods directly to the cold storage facility. The second reason was to visit several food companies he had previously located. Some of them specialized in freeze-dried vegetables and soup bases, while others focused on prepared meals and preserves in flexible packaging. These flexible containers are essentially specialized bags made of plastic and aluminum. They offered clearance products like taro balls, tapioca pearls, mochi, dried tofu, iced jelly, milk tea powder, and a long list of other items. There were also manufacturers of various frozen meat products nearby. If everything went according to plan, this container with over 78 cubic meters of frozen products would be enough to feed Jack's entire family for 3 whole years. And the most important part was that the truck's refrigeration system was portable and could be plugged into any power source. He could dismantle it, move it to the storage area, build a shed around it, and just like that, he had his own cold storage room. The company warehouse was secure, equipped with a computer-controlled cooling facility. The company warehouse is, without a doubt, the ideal substitute for a standard refrigerator. Besides, we see that they have plenty of insulating material left over. That afternoon, he drove a container full of merchandise back to the site, returned to his company's warehouse, and parked the truck. His father-in-law had already arrived. The two of them went to the agency to replace a vehicle's engine. His father-in-law pointed to one side, where the grains and oil had finally arrived. The shells had arrived too. When he walked in, someone asked what all this was for. He told them that Jack had taken on a project for a village supermarket. The merchandise is arriving little by little, just as planned. The shop over there is already prepared, so there shouldn't be any problems. He had already moved the materials for the acoustic panel room to the 4th floor using the forklift, loading them into the elevator. He tested it, and to be honest, it works quite well. Now, it was just a matter of screwing the frame together for the final installation. Using the forklift to hold the panel, they align the holes and screw everything into place. And there we have it. He likely struggled to align those holes all by himself, didn't he? Ben returned later that afternoon, and with his help, they finally got the panel secured. It was surprisingly fast. They didn't linger. They simply dropped him off and headed home. After locking the warehouse gate, the two of them took a taxi to the high-speed rail station. They were going to pick up Jack's car. On the way, his father-in-law asked a pointed question. He noted that all of Jack's plans so far seemed focused entirely on hiding away. If the day comes when hiding is no longer an option, how exactly does he plan to escape? Jack sat in silence, watching the traffic light flicker as he considered the reality of the situation. He had already thought of that. Tomorrow, he planned to take the family van and his own SUV to the dealership for a full maintenance check to ensure they were ready for anything. Both vehicles were top-tier hybrid models, built for endurance and reliability. With a full tank and a maximum charge, they could cover over 1,200 kilometers without stopping. He also made sure the auxiliary fuel tank in the SUV would be topped off and ready. Earlier that day, he had asked Ben to bring an extra 160 liters of gasoline for the trip. With those reserves, their total range would extend to over 2,500 kilometers. The advanced hybrid system in these cars offers multiple driving modes for any situation. They provide great power, high speed, and incredible stability, even under heavy loads. Low fuel consumption is just one of the many advantages they would rely on. Jack's own vehicle has an impressive electric-only range of over 240 kilometers. His father-in-law's luxury van matches that, offering over 240 kilometers of silent electric travel. It is, quite frankly, ideal for moving through zombie-infested zones in total silence. But he wasn't stopping there. He planned to install explosion-proof, all-terrain tires on both of the vehicles. After the 27th, they would completely block off the stairs, and then they would begin welding protective mesh screens onto the cars. Under normal circumstances, the cars would remain parked on the first floor, tucked away in the most secluded corner of the loading bay. On the outside, we see they could simply erect a drywall to seal the entire area off. If something were to happen, they would only need to drive right through the drywall and be on their way. But how would they even get to the car when the time comes to escape? There could be zombies or desperate people waiting just outside. When the warehouse was originally built, the owners had included escape routes for safety. However, it was nothing more than a pole, the kind you hug and slide down. The previous owner, wanting things to look professional, had asked Jack to cover the pole up. Now, he realized he only needed to place enough cushioning material at the bottom. Even though they hadn't practiced the maneuver yet, he felt they could certainly manage it. But then he caught himself. No, they couldn't afford to just hope for the best. Once they moved in, he decided that everyone would have to practice until it was second nature. After picking up the car, our duo took a detour to the agricultural machinery market. The agricultural drones from DJI have plenty of power and a long flight time, but they are quite expensive. To be honest, he had no intention of buying one. Instead, he rented one using credit and scheduled a series of formal procedures. Upon arrival, he requested a meeting with the pilot and agreed to collect the drone on the 27th. The pilot was scheduled to meet with him later that same afternoon. Deep down, he hoped the man would show up. He wouldn't mind bringing him along to survive. We see them check the time. It was already 8 o'clock. They decided not to head home, grabbing a quick bite on the street before returning to the warehouse. He switched on all 8 groups of the 64 explosion-proof ceiling lights. After that, he closed the door and stayed there, exhausted, stepping outside for just a moment. The sound wasn't loud, but one couldn't exactly say there was no noise at all. For the next half hour, they conducted repeated tests to check the levels. They confirmed that if they only turned on one group, the sound became almost imperceptible. In that case, he realized he needed to install switches to change from groups of 8 to groups of 2. No sooner said than done. While taking a switch apart, he discovered that the light control wasn't in a series, but used a bridge with the neutral wire in parallel. That made things much easier. He disconnected the neutral wire, leaving only 2 lights active on the circuit. And indeed, for a moment, there was absolute silence. One didn't even have to leave the room for the sound to vanish completely. It took him about half an hour to change all the light groups so that each switch controlled only 2 bulbs, finally finishing the entire installation. He made sure to leave some extra cable to install another switch later on. We see him consider the living room, since the lack of internet in the bedroom meant there was no way for him to manage the server from there. He had even toyed with the idea of installing smart switches, a nice touch, surely. After that, he took a look at the prefabricated house his father-in-law had assembled. Everything seemed in order, so they each hopped onto a forklift and continued with the work. By 11:30, the prefab house was finally ready. On the following day, they planned to use structural adhesive and glass silicone. This would seal the joints properly, leaving the interior work for after the 27th. He and his father-in-law went up to the 3rd floor to inspect the stairwell ceiling. It was a triangular space, measuring about 1.5 meters wide, 2.4 meters high, and 4.2 meters deep. In total, that came to exactly 7.56 cubic meters. If they were to fill the entire thing with concrete, it would weigh 17 tons. The staircase, however, could only support about 3.3 tons. So, naturally, sealing it completely with concrete was out of the question. He and his father-in-law stood there for quite a while, lost in thought. In the end, the only logical conclusion was to demolish the staircase entirely. He thought it over and told his father-in-law that demolishing the staircase, whether by cutting it or using sledgehammers, was simply too much trouble. It would create a massive amount of noise and a terrible scandal. They had to think of something else, because if they weren't going to cut through reinforced concrete, the only option left was to blow it up. But getting mining dynamite is quite difficult these days, isn't it? The authorities control it strictly, but ammonium nitrate isn't actually that hard to make. He suggested they could simply prepare it themselves. Ammonium nitrate is a dangerous substance, after all, explosive and heavily restricted by the state. His father-in-law asked if he wasn't a humanities major, noting that, as far as he remembered, chemistry wasn't exactly his son-in-law's forte. They decided that on the night of the 27th, they would seal the fire door with cement and set the detonators on the stairs. Then, in the early hours of the 28th, they would blow it sky high. He and his father-in-law returned to the city and, first things first, went to enjoy a long, hot soak at the local steam baths. After all, in a few days, there likely wouldn't be another chance. A good soak, some time in the steam, and a thorough scrub later. They felt fresh as daisies and sat down to enjoy some grilled skewers. And that was that. Everything was finally in place. The The preparations were complete. It was a moment of quiet satisfaction. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. The pieces were all on the board, and so they waited for the right moment. It was a simple enough conclusion to a long day. Just like that, the stage was set. There was nothing left to do but proceed. The plan was simple, yet effective, and with that, they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. But of course, our story doesn't end there. Dealing with pests in the cold storage was better than nothing, but it wasn't enough. He realized it was urgent to launch a comprehensive plan against flies and mosquitoes. He called an old college friend to ask for some expert advice on the matter. They discussed designing systems for pest control, heat, and insects in large buildings. His friend sent over his location and invited him to come visit his factory. He checked the time and realized the schedule worked out perfectly. Besides, the place wasn't far from his house at all. It was a good chance to see him in person, so he stopped by his in-laws' house to pick up his car. He also planned to pick up his wife so they could go together. By the time they reached the factory, there were actually 3 of them in the car. His sister-in-law had tagged along like glue. As it turned out, our friend's factory was a chocolate factory. They produced pure chocolate, handling the entire fermentation process themselves. Roasting, grinding, tempering, and packaging. The whole process happens right there. His friend gave them a detailed tour of the facility, though he was clearly a bit puzzled. He couldn't quite understand why Alex was so intensely interested in the heat-proofing measures of his workshop and warehouse. Regarding the control of insects, mosquitoes, and flies, he explained in great detail how to set up the appropriate barriers. They covered every key point, including multiple non-lethal optical devices and various active and passive capture systems. They even discussed the layout of chemical barriers and other defenses. Alex spent the next 2 hours taking a massive amount of photos. He also asked his friend to help him create a rough design for a similar space. After getting the contact info for the suppliers and loading up 2 huge boxes of complimentary chocolates, they said their goodbyes and left the factory. On the way back, his wife took the list of suppliers his friend had provided. She began calling them one by one to order all the necessary equipment. However, things like the rat-proof plates, mosquito screens, and pesticide channels couldn't be ordered ready-made. It seemed they would have to build those themselves. We see them stop by the dealership to give the tank a complete service. The mechanics thoroughly inspected the battery and the engine. Later, Alex took the car to a friend's shop to swap the tires for run flats. They also applied a dark tint to all the windows, and they added a matte black wrap. By the time they finished the whole wrapping process, it was already noon. The 3 of them went out for Japanese food. After all, they wouldn't be able to eat raw fish for a very long time. On the way to the cold storage, Alex started thinking and called one of his suppliers. He ordered 2 stainless steel cages on wheels, sized specifically for the SUV and the van, respectively. These would cover the cars completely, maintaining a distance of 30 centimeters from the bodywork. The cage design was based on the slat armor used on tanks. They were welded with stainless steel angles, measuring 5 by 5 centimeters and 3 millimeters thick. Once the cages arrived, he planned to weld on some stainless steel plates to give them a shutter-like shape. Finally, he would weld the cage directly to the roof rack. As long as the cage's own wheels touched the ground, the chassis wouldn't have to support excessive weight. Although the battery range would certainly decrease, the defense would increase considerably, even helping them smash through plaster walls, or even plow through entire hordes of zombies. Upon arriving at the cold storage warehouse, Alex stored the chocolates, the cooling supplies, and the pest control items in their designated spots. He spent some time discussing a security matter with his father-in-law regarding the safety of the landing. Once the stairs were finally blown up, even without stairs, they wondered what might happen if something were capable of jumping that high. After weighing their options, they decided that once the stairs were destroyed, they would use the forklift to block the landing with a heavy concrete slab. The stair landing, now reinforced with precast concrete, would essentially become a stone fortress. They had begun to think of every possible entry point with meticulous, perhaps even obsessive, detail. Every strategic angle was being considered to ensure the perimeter remained absolutely impenetrable against the coming chaos. To finish the job, Alex brought back some extra tinting film. After all, according to the law, the windshield and front windows aren't supposed to have privacy tint, so he handed the film over to his wife and her sister. He figured they could handle it. The main task for tonight was to begin drilling into the stairs on both sides. Meanwhile, Alex was alone on the 5th floor preparing the explosive charges to take the stairs down. When he finished, he put the charges away with extreme care. All that remained was to handle the detonators, and his work would be done. He took a moment to stretch before stepping into the elevator. And here we see that his father-in-law has already replaced the elevator's control panel. Now, without the proper passcode, no one can reach the 4th floor, which is exactly how he wanted it. At noon, we see Alex receiving a call from the factory to let him know his cages were finally ready. He had to move quickly, as he still needed to get the ones he bought this morning into the cold storage. He switched to a truck to head out and pick up the new batch of cages. While at the factory, he noticed they also had razor wire available. He decided to grab some wire mesh and seamless steel pipes as well. You can never be too prepared. After that, he stopped by a hardware store and purchased 5,000 impact nails. These items are typically used for installing ceiling structures, but they can be quite effective with a small modification. Back at the cold storage, His father-in-law and the rest of the family had also returned from their errands. They had spent the day buying bedding, towels, bath linens, and plenty of toilet paper. They also stocked up on feminine hygiene products and personal toiletries, along with cleaning supplies and other various household essentials. Their vehicle was packed to the very ceiling with supplies. While the women began sorting and storing everything, Alex and his father-in-law grabbed the welding torches. They immediately set to work welding steel plates onto the iron cages. They worked until 9 in the evening, by which time the project was nearly finished. They reinforced the outer walls of the cages with strips of stainless steel, leaving a gap of exactly 5 centimeters between each one. This design serves as a solid defense while still allowing them to maintain a clear view of the outside. Finally, the exterior was wrapped in razor wire, blades facing out. The entrance is located at the very top, positioned directly beneath the skylight. Once a person climbs inside, they simply pull the lid shut to secure themselves. For stainless steel bolts will drop into place by gravity, locking the lid tight. It is, for all intents and purposes, absolutely impossible to open from the outside. The body of the cage sits on 12 swivel wheels equipped with elastic connections. This not only improves mobility, but also helps distribute the cage's significant weight. And with a touch of grim style, Alex painted both cages in a matte black finish. Now, all that remains is to wait until the 27th to finally assemble them. After that, we see the family returning to the father-in-law's house for dinner. His sister-in-law handed him a detailed list, noting that their current supplies were lacking. She pointed out that their reserves of medicine and medical instruments were simply not enough. The way they were currently storing everything was also becoming a bit of a concern. It was a problem that needed solving, as his sister-in-law carefully explained to him. When he had asked her sister to pick her up, they only bought basic, common medications. But they were missing anti-inflammatories, stomach medicines, iodine, and other vital supplies. The list continued with medical-grade disinfectant, saline solution, gauze, and surgical tape. She also included absorbent cotton, swabs, medical dressings, and various other essentials. They didn't have nearly enough, and the realization made Alex break into a cold sweat. Her list even included 2 refrigerators, a pressure cooker, and a specialized water distiller. He understood using the cooker for sterilization and obtaining clean water. To be honest, she was right. Alex understood the distilled water, but he couldn't help asking why they needed 2 more refrigerators. After all, they had already brought an entire cold storage room with them. His sister-in-law explained that every medication requires a specific, stable storage temperature. Furthermore, it was vital to avoid the temperature fluctuations that occurred during the disinfection process. Storage temperature affects the body most, so they couldn't just keep opening the fridge. 2 units were better. She explained this with remarkable patience, and that, as it turned out, was not all. They also needed to store several common vaccines and essential injections for the future. She specifically mentioned the rabies vaccine and tetanus shots as prime examples. Alex finally gave in. If they were doing this, he decided they might as well go all out. He told her to get a large chest freezer instead of a standard one. They didn't need another vertical refrigerator since they already had 2 at the house. By repurposing one of those, they could manage. He then added 10 kilograms of absorbent cotton to the list. Next came a kilogram of gauze and 20 sets of disposable gas masks. These were items they intended to keep with them at all times, just in case. He also ordered 12 motorized breathing apparatuses equipped with fans and filters. These would be kept in the car, alongside 4 level 3 protection suits. He even requested 5 kilograms of penicillin, telling her to just buy a whole container. And vitamins, a full kilogram of each, from A to E, ensuring nothing was missing. It was in this moment that medicine started to look like a very wise investment. He was surprised to learn that a kilogram of vitamins only cost about $40. Quite a bargain, really. Morning arrived. It was now the 27th of June. After 6 days of intense preparation, we can finally say that our work has entered its final phase. Over the last 5 days, we have completed a series of complex and rather arduous operations. We successfully constructed a shelter, and now, it is time for a brief summary of our progress. The plan is broadly divided into 4 key aspects: clothing, food, shelter, and transportation. A simple list, perhaps, but a vital one for what is coming. First, we look at clothing. Beyond moving all their current clothes to the shelter, they took extra precautions. They also stored a full year's supply of spare undergarments for every single person. To face potential extreme weather, they prepared several sets of Arctic-style thermal gear. They readied high-level protection suits for both winter and summer conditions. They even included lightweight suits designed specifically for mosquito and insect protection. Alex even went as far as modifying down-filled pet clothing to serve as protective suits for their animals. And finally, they added more thermal layers. Second, we move on to the food. They didn't just store 78 cubic meters of frozen products, which is impressive enough. This included prepared meal kits and portions of chicken, duck, beef, lamb, pork, and fish. They also stockpiled 110 cubic meters of room temperature provisions. This massive haul included 50 sacks of rice to ensure they wouldn't go hungry. There were 30 sacks of mixed grains and 15 sacks of flour ready for use. They added 10 barrels of soybean oil, 50 kilograms of cured meat, and a mountain of other snacks. Food is the very essence of life, after all. Now, let us examine the features of the shelter itself. We see 15 kilograms of various seasonings alongside all sorts of dried noodles and similar staples. They also established a hydroponic cultivation area covering 150 square meters, which sits right next to a newly built chicken coop. Of course, they didn't forget to stock plenty of food for the pets as well. They even stockpiled up to 750 kilograms of biodegradable cat litter. But before we dive deeper into the shelter, we must discuss the transportation. They modified the Bioatatang and the Tenside 9 models, effectively transforming them into heavy-duty armored vehicles. And this modification brought about a rather unexpected benefit. They managed to create extra storage space between the bodywork and the roll cage. In this hidden space, they can store an additional 120 liters of gasoline. His father-in-law used seamless tubes and a one-way valve to connect the main fuel tank directly to the canisters. Now, they can refill the tank with fuel from the spare drums without even stepping out of the car. This clever trick gives both vehicles a range exceeding 3,000 kilometers. Starting tomorrow, these two vehicles will serve as their escape plan should the shelter ever become unsafe. Furthermore, each car is designed to serve as a backup for the other. Therefore, they have also stocked the vehicles with 6 sets of outdoor protection suits, complete with active respirators per car, a 60-liter water tank, equipped with a UV sterilizer, 2 first aid kits, and 3 warm blankets. We also see 2 sets of spare clothes for each car, along with a 60-liter water tank with a UV sterilizer, 2 first aid kits, and 3 blankets. On the roof of the vehicle, there is a similar amount of provisions stored safely, secured within the roll cage. They have also tucked away another 120 liters of gasoline, a trench shovel, and various other essential tools. The vehicles are currently parked on the first floor, right in front of the loading bay door, hidden behind a false wall built from light steel profiles and drywall. Finally, we come to the shelter itself, which is where they invested the most during the house's construction. This area spans the first and second floors of the refrigerated warehouse. To be honest, they still look like a messy construction site, but any piece of street art that might give them away was moved up to the 4th floor. To any stranger looking in from the outside, this place appears to have been abandoned for a very long time, containing absolutely nothing of value. This applies to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 5th floors. All the water and electricity conduits leading up to the 4th floor have been sealed and filled with a large amount of viscous leak-sealing material, which was carefully mixed with a specialized foaming agent. This will eventually form a solid mass, similar to a sponge, which not only blocks the passage but also absorbs vibrations and sound. The 3rd and 5th floors remain completely empty. The goal is to ensure that any intruder, however unlikely their arrival might be, will mistakenly believe that the building contains no supplies and is completely empty. The elevators in the Banton building no longer even show that a 4th floor exists. Once the stairs are destroyed, the 4th floor will remain completely hidden from view. The building's cold storage area was divided into 4 parts, and the living quarters are wrapped in thick, soundproof walls. To be honest, it is quite a fortress. Even if the noise inside reaches 90 decibels, absolutely nothing can be heard outside. However, this level of silence actually sparked a bit of a family disagreement. With such excellent insulation, was it really necessary to limit the volume in the living area? After discussing the matter, the family eventually reached a sensible agreement. To maintain a quiet life, the storage area was placed just outside the living zone. 40 pallets divide the space like pieces on a giant chessboard. By using a coding system and control boards similar to those in modern restaurants, finding their supplies is both quick and easy. Efficiency is key, after all. The waste processing area is located in the center of the living zone, in a 4th floor corner. It includes the bathroom and the specialized treatment area. This zone is responsible for both the treatment of wastewater and the management of solid waste. Nothing is left to chance in this self-contained world. A specially built, soundproof operating room converts solid waste into bricks. These are stacked with the accumulated trash under intense ultraviolet light and a high concentration of ozone to keep everything sterile and odorless. Finally, we come to the cultivation area, the heart of their self-sufficiency. It includes several hydroponic tanks and even a small chicken coop. This will be our family's only source of fresh vegetables and meat in the future. As for the appliances, besides the refrigerator they had already planned for, they added a washing machine, television, rice cooker, steam oven, and dishwasher. There is an electric blanket, a heater, a water purifier, an electric kettle, an air fryer, and even an electric pressure cooker for good measure. Of course, we also see 2 small household drones and a specialized maintenance drone. All of the building's original water and electricity systems have been disconnected. Even the original power system for the elevator was completely destroyed. The key components of the large water purification equipment on the 1st floor, such as the circuit boards, the water pump, the tank, and the intake valves, have all been carefully removed and hidden away. This creates the perfect illusion that these conventional parts were stolen by a common thief. They even went so far as to cut and remove the cables. But the well the original owner drilled in secret was carefully concealed from prying eyes. Regarding the stairs, those energy-generating crystals that looked like a Simple glass wall were also secured for their own personal use. So, in reality, the building has more than enough water and electricity to spare. Lying in bed, Ryan reviews his preparations for tomorrow over and over again. It doesn't matter how well prepared he might be. Deep down, he feels a sharp pang of panic. He takes a deep breath, gets out of bed, and finishes the very last details. Our family simply has to face this coming apocalypse. He rose at 6 and disconnected every single appliance in the house, one by one. By 7 o'clock, the entire family had finished their breakfast. Yesterday, he told his mother they were going on a trip today. His mother already had her things ready to go when his father-in-law picked her up. They will head to the shelter first. At 9, the movers finally arrived. They began moving the appliances and the other supplies he had packed for his mother. He had already parked the truck the day before. He kept it as close to the house as possible. The workers are only responsible for loading the items and securing them on the pallets exactly as instructed. At 12 minutes past 10, the move was officially finished. He locked the door, paid the workers, and everyone went their separate ways. It is now 11:48. Driving the truck, he intentionally took the highway to take a long route through the streets. He was heading into the city. He drove the truck all the way to the cold storage warehouse. The guard at the entrance of the industrial complex was the same one he remembered. He wonders if, just like in his memories, things will unfold the same way. By the time he returns to this complex, he will already be a zombie. At 12:20, with the help of a forklift, the unloading was completed quickly. He went up to find his mother and bring her back down with him. With the old woman by his side, he drove the truck to a warehouse 12 kilometers away. He looked at her, but she simply told him he didn't have to say a word. She understood perfectly why he had kept the information hidden until now. Now, finally, he was in a position where he could warn the others. Right here, the press conference being broadcast would reveal the location of their shelter. He signaled to his father-in-law, Mark, to bring the car around immediately. The plan was simple. As soon as they gave the alert, they would leave. At this point, this was the only family car left that was capable of getting out. Half an hour later, his mother-in-law finished her call and got into the car in silence. They began their return at full speed because only 5 minutes earlier, everything had changed. Videos had already begun appearing on TikTok showing zombies biting people in the streets. They had to hurry back to the shelter to seal it off from the world. They covered those 12 kilometers in less than 10 minutes, a frantic pace, naturally. His mother-in-law and his wife, Sarah, were waiting anxiously at the ground floor elevator. As they backed the car into the hidden parking area, we see the preparations in place. The heavy iron cage was already suspended in the air, ready for the final step. Once they finish installing the false wall, they will park the car inside for good. We find the forklift waiting right at the entrance of the ground floor elevator. The plan was to remove the battery and the circuit board, effectively locking the elevator on the top floor. He would then slide down the shaft to the car to secure the iron cage to the bodywork. By the time his father-in-law hauled him back up, it was already past 3 in the afternoon. The city center had transformed into a literal hell on earth. There were no living souls left in the streets, only zombies wandering aimlessly. He couldn't afford to rest, so he brought out the shock-absorbing nitrate. He kept the camera and the detonators from the 5th floor close at hand. With great care, he placed them one by one into the holes they had drilled in the stairs and landings. He carefully connected the wires to a total of 220 cartridges. It was already 5 o'clock. He confirmed the time with his wife, Sarah, who was watching the monitors. For the moment, there were no zombies nearby. He pressed the detonator through the thick layers of soundproofing material. The sound of the explosion was surprisingly muffled. It sounded a bit like someone knocking on a door, though the roar of the stairs collapsing was undeniably loud. Boom. Just like that, the path was gone. We see the results from the monitor on the top floor of the stairwell. Essentially, they had achieved their objective, and not a moment too soon. The only real issue now was the overwhelming amount of smoke and dust. Another half hour passed. He made a final round to inspect the defenses and found nothing out of place. He found no issues at all. Even the water and electricity were still running without a hitch. Now, finally, they could install the control system. It was time to see if their hard work would pay off. By the time they finished everything, it was already time for dinner. They looked at their supplies and realized they had a bit of a deadline. Since the fresh vegetables he brought wouldn't last many days, they decided to have a feast. They even brought out the prized Cokes, a rare luxury in such times. The television was broadcasting the latest news updates for the final hour of the day. The news anchor, visibly trying to maintain his composure, prepared to read the official statement once more. The broadcast emphasized that things had to be handled differently now, as the cause of the disease remained unknown. The authorities were pleading with all residents to stay in their homes and wait for rescue. The message was clear: the country would not abandon anyone, or so they claimed. At the same time, a message arrived on his phone from the neighborhood committee, asking to conduct a census of the inhabitants in every single house. They decided not to respond. After all, they weren't actually in that residential zone anymore, and they certainly didn't need any outside provisions for the time being. If they provided information about an evacuation later on, he figured they would respond then. There was no rush. After dinner, his mother and mother-in-law, who were completely exhausted from the long day, were the first to head off to sleep. He and his father-in-law, Mike, debated for a bit, but in the end, it was his turn to take the first watch. Earlier that morning, Mike had cut the signal to the external cameras to avoid detection. He focused on the guardhouse, redirecting the video signal directly to their living quarters. The bathroom they had originally planned for that space was moved elsewhere. Now, that small room serves as a dedicated monitoring hub for all the interior cameras. Every camera from the factory and the shelter, both inside and out, was connected. Everything was centralized here, with 8 screens forming a modest wall of monitors. There was no audio, of course, but they could see absolutely everything. On the screens, we see the main street is empty and completely deserted. The solar-powered streetlights flickered on automatically as the light faded. It was hardly surprising to see no people or cars out on the road. This location sat right on the very edge of the thoroughfare. The main road bordered the industrial zone, with nothing but open fields behind it. The heat had been intense this year, causing the wheat to ripen early. The harvest was already finished. The nearest residential complex was 3 kilometers away. Those were newly built relocation houses intended for the local farmers. Our protagonist, Mark, had passed by that area just a few days prior. He had heard the official handover ceremony for the houses was set for June 30th. Because of that, no one lived there yet. This wasn't exactly a bustling city center. It wasn't a main avenue or near any major highway or significant transit route. Hardly anyone ever came this way, and now they were even less likely to. He spent his time watching the monitors and checking the news for any updates. And as we might have expected, the news reports that the virus's reach, centered in the neighboring province's capital, is expanding with terrifying speed. The army has already been mobilized to deal with the crisis. It was just like the trial version, a virus spreading far too fast to contain. Even with the military on the move, they had no effective solution to offer. At least, not yet. The soldiers still couldn't bring themselves to fire on their own people, and so, the standoff continued until dawn. His sister-in-law arrived to relieve him, following the pattern of the trial version. Since no people or cars had appeared on the monitors, he finally went to sleep. If his memory served, the old gatekeeper would be arriving shortly after 10. On his way, the man would encounter a zombie child who would bite him. Upon reaching the complex, he would run into Mark just as his shift ended, only to transform right in the middle of a conversation with the workers. In that timeline, the workers and Mark would be forced to kill him together. After that, he would have to race back to the city in a desperate hurry. The city, having endured 24 hours of relentless zombie attacks, would be a total disaster. He would find his mother's body near the town hall. Then, upon reaching his father-in-law's house, he would find himself unable to enter. On the way home, he would risk a stop at the local distribution warehouse. He would grab some food and run home to finally reunite with his wife. In the end, due to the lack of food, they would eventually have to risk leaving the safety of their home. Zach shook his head, trying to push those chaotic thoughts out of his mind. He set his phone alarm for 10 o'clock and fell into a deep sleep almost immediately. We returned to Zach, who was already settled into the relative safety of the shelter. Still, he couldn't help but wonder just how catastrophic the disaster had become outside those walls. He woke up just a few minutes before 10, feeling slightly more rested. For a while, he simply lay in bed, scrolling through his phone to check for updates. Once the alarm finally buzzed, he got up to wash his face and brush his teeth. To conserve their water supply, the entire family had switched to using edible pet toothpaste. It was quite practical, to be honest, though the flavor was difficult to describe. He walked into the living room just as his mother-in-law was opening the steam oven. She had saved him some pork and century egg congee, served with a side of pickles. He sat down and began to devour the meal without a second thought. As he ate, he checked his phone and asked about the organic waste from the day before. There weren't many leftovers remaining, as the family had finished most of them that morning. His mother-in-law smiled and asked if he was really worried about the organic trash. It had only been a few vegetable leaves and minor scraps, nothing of great importance. They had given all of it to the dog, along with whatever was left over from breakfast. She joked that the fancy waste disposal unit he bought wasn't even necessary now. Buster had eaten every bit of it, proving to be a surprisingly useful addition to the household. It seemed they might even be able to save a little money on the dog's food. After that, Zach stayed on his phone for a while, taking a much-needed break. He wondered when the others would step in, or if their own positions were just as precarious. He waited patiently, watching as Tony moved with a sudden, desperate urgency. The man was clearly distressed, his emotions bubbling over. His eyes were wide and vacant, filled with a strange sense of complacency as he walked. They were heading toward the sculpture passage, where a dark and bitter atmosphere awaited them. It was a grim sight, to be perfectly honest. Not long after, Zach went to the monitoring center just as the heavy doors were opening. The old man had returned, arriving on his electric scooter and driving slowly. He steered with one hand, while shaking the other blindly from time to time. He had already been bitten, and we see him enter through the gate to park his scooter. He walked toward the guard shack, opened the door, went inside, and shut it behind him. A moment later, the outdoor air conditioning unit hummed to life. A few more minutes passed, and suddenly, the door to the guard shack swung open again. The old man stumbled out, took 2 shaky steps, and collapsed onto the ground. His sister-in-law, visibly trembling, grabbed his clothes and asked if the man was dead. Zach moved slightly to free his shirt from her grip and told her that he was indeed dead. But he wasn't entirely gone, as Zack pointed toward the glowing screen. On the monitor, they watched as the old man's legs began to kick and twitch. Suddenly, the body flipped over and rose from the ground, arching its back in a way that no normal person could possibly achieve. To be honest, it was a movement that defied biology. The creature straightened itself up slowly. As we zoom in, we see that his skin had turned a sickly grayish color, while his veins had darkened into a deep, bruised black. His sister-in-law began to observe the zombie's behavior with a strange, intense interest. Meanwhile, Zack returned to the living room, put on his headphones, and sat down to watch a series with his wife. By the third day of the outbreak, he checked the waste tank and saw it had already exceeded 10%. Of the 12 20-liter sewage tanks they had prepared, 3 were already full. He informed the whole family, and they decided it was time to carry out the first waste disposal. Starting with the toilet, Zack put on his mask and began the rather unpleasant task. He dragged the sewage tank out, taking every precaution to prevent the stench from leaking into their living space. He had installed 3 water siphons and 2 pipe siphons to manage the backflow of waste. This setup included 2 gravity check valves and a mechanical gate to keep everything contained. They also covered the drain outlet with 3 heavy lids made of 5mm stainless steel plates. Between these layers, they placed high-resistance rubber seals for an airtight finish. As he emptied the sewage from the tank, Zack observed carefully how the solids had broken down. He was particularly interested in the odor, or lack thereof, which was a vital part of their survival. This was because, in those first 3 tanks, they had added decomposition agents and deodorants. They hadn't been stingy, using double the normal dose to ensure everything stayed manageable. In the other tanks, they used 1.5 and 1.25 times the standard amount, just to be safe, respectively. After comparing the results from all 3 tanks, they decided that from now on, they would use the 1.5 dose. Next came the gray water system, where we see they have 2 storage tanks. Each has a 5-ton capacity, and both are equipped with UV light and ozone disinfection units. One of them functions as the clean water tank, storing what they pump from the well. They always keep it full. If they use a ton of water, they simply pump another ton back in. It's a rotation system. The other is the sewage tank, where the bottom 30% is reserved for sludge sedimentation. They even built outlets at the 10 and 50% marks of the tank's height for proper drainage. The water in this sewage tank isn't just sitting there, however. It is also used to flush out the main drainage pipes. Zack released 100 kilos of wastewater to wash away the waste. After that, he used another 10 kilos of clean water to rinse the pipes. Once the job was finished, he sealed the drainage pipe once again. He washed and disinfected his hands before returning to the living area. His sister-in-law pointed at the lone zombie, noting that they seem to lack sight. Yet they can clearly sense light. They have no love for the sun. They hide in the shadows, and they are extremely sensitive to sound. They can follow the direction of a sound with terrifying precision. Their movements aren't particularly agile, but temperature seems to affect them greatly. In the heat, they move faster. In the cold, not so much. As for their sense of smell, that remains a mystery for now. They spent some time monitoring the drainage, which was exactly as he remembered it. Today, the internet was flooded with news about the infected and various official government announcements. On one hand, they urged everyone to stay indoors and wait for rescue. On the other, they finally authorized the military to use lethal force. According to the official version, the army would establish safe zones first. They planned to slowly clear the surrounding areas to expand those perimeters. The first safe zones would be in small towns and rural areas, where the population density is low and there are fewer infected. In those places, a defense system is much easier to establish. Zack checked the community group and saw there were plenty of survivors, though most of them were already running out of supplies. Some had even begun trying to trade whatever they had for food. He felt a twinge of regret for not pointing the security cameras outward. He wanted to see the world outside, but there wasn't much he could do now. It was the 5th day of the outbreak, and the shelter's surroundings remained unchanged. Everything remained quiet and completely empty outside. Only that one lone zombie continued to wander aimlessly around the area. And the most curious thing is that the creature seems unwilling to crouch or even lower its head. The old man, before he turned, had closed the main gate he always used. However, the side door was left ajar, and it happens to be exactly 1 head shorter than he is. But the stubborn thing simply refuses to duck down in order to get out. Zack usually waits a few minutes for the zombie to drift away from the entrance. Meanwhile, on the internet, a wave of negativity was beginning to spread across every platform. And naturally, a few troublemakers were already starting to stir the pot. Some claimed that if you left the country, everything was perfectly fine and wonderful, which was a lie, of course. Almost instantly, citizens living abroad began posting photos and videos to shut them up and reveal the grim reality. Over there, authorities were tirelessly repeating the same orders: do not go out, and remain silent while waiting to be rescued. They also released official information regarding the creation of the very first safe zone. While this sparked hope, 2 internet personalities, Leo and Gary, suddenly made an appearance. Consequently, the comment section turned back into a lively battlefield where everyone wanted to be the star. Suddenly, his wife's voice crackled over the radio, telling him to come quickly because a car was approaching. She sounded urgent as she spoke through the communicator. We see that in their rotation, Zach and his father-in-law are responsible for the night shift. We learn that Zach's wife and sister are currently handling the day shift. This daytime watch runs from 6 in the morning until 8 at night. They split it into 7-hour blocks, while the night shift is only 5. At this moment, his wife is covering the final shift of the day. He hurried into the monitoring room and saw a white van on the screen. The vehicle was wobbling dangerously as it approached their position. It was painfully obvious that the van was struggling to move forward at all. It reached the corner and stopped, and the driver hopped out to check the tires. The front left tire was clearly shredded, leaving the van completely flat. The driver climbed back in and steered the vehicle toward their factory. From the look of it, he wants to hide inside and change the tire. Zach quickly scanned the monitors to locate the wandering zombie. He eventually spotted it at the far end of the factory grounds. Though it was far, the path between the creature and the main gate was a straight line. The factory's sliding gate is equipped with an automatic license plate recognition system. He had set it up that way to make bringing in supplies much easier. The recognition function is still active, but now it simply records everything it sees. Essentially, any car with a license plate can enter without a problem. That is why the van entered so easily, and though they couldn't hear a thing through the thick walls. The zombie's sudden movements on the monitor told them everything they needed to know. It was obvious the creature had heard something, as it began shuffling toward the main gate. The driver turned right and parked not far from the entrance, unaware of the danger. Watching calmly as the heavy gate began to slide shut behind him, he stepped out, glanced around the yard, and started walking toward the guardhouse. He peered into the guardhouse, took a few hesitant steps, then stopped to look back at the van before returning. It seemed someone else inside the vehicle had kept him from exploring any further. The driver then pulled a small canister out of the trunk. From what we could see, it looked like a simple can of tire sealant. He knelt by the front left tire and began his work, oblivious to the approaching threat. Zach and his wife watched the monitors, their nerves stretched to the breaking point. The zombie had already covered more than half the distance when, quite suddenly, it appeared within the very same camera frame as the driver. The man finally stood up and began saying something to the person still in the car. When he finally turned and saw the zombie, it was barely 10 meters away from him. He scrambled back into the car, stumbling over his own feet in a blind panic, started the engine, and threw the van into a frantic reverse toward the main street. He maneuvered to the gate, waited for it to open, and sped away like a man possessed. As they watched the heavy gate finally click shut behind the retreating vehicle, Zach and his wife both let out a long, shaky sigh of relief. When he could finally breathe again, Zach realized his hands were completely soaked in sweat. And although Zach was genuinely happy for the man, he couldn't help but grumble a little. If you're going to make a run for it, the least you could do is take the zombies with you. Instead, they were left right there. We have now reached the 10th day of the outbreak. As one might expect in such a crisis, the water and electricity were finally cut off, and the internet, amidst a never-ending flood of digital cries for help, barely managed to hold on for another 20 hours before going dark. Only the solar streetlights remained lit, standing as the last flickering remnants of dignity for modern civilization. Without the web, they found themselves trapped in a bubble of misinformation. All they could do was pass the time watching the movies and series they had previously saved, which, in hindsight, was a very wise move. The total lack of communication with the outside world made them quieter among themselves as well. To keep their mental health from slipping, Zach's sister-in-law volunteered to lead a daily exercise routine. They also established a set of internal rules to limit their screen time, hoping to keep their minds sharp while the world outside crumbled. But, to everyone's surprise, his father-in-law managed to construct a makeshift microwave antenna. The signal was terrible, to be honest, but at least they could pick up a few channels. The national channel did nothing but broadcast endless official statements to the nation. The Zen channel only showed emergency notifications, and the local channels for their own province had already lost their signal entirely. However, the city channel from Zen in the neighboring province was still broadcasting some news. We can assume the Zen City channel was still broadcasting emergency notifications because the neighboring province had more military garrisons. They maintained much tighter control there. Besides, it was a heavily industrialized province. With superior industrial capacity and infrastructure, their power supply was also more stable than our own, and so, their lives entered the first critical stage. By critical, we aren't referring to their general supplies of food, nor was it a matter of waste management. The real problem was that they had finally run out of fresh vegetables and meat. At least, that was the problem for some. For the 3 younger members of the group, it wasn't such a dire situation, but the 3 elders simply couldn't get used to the change. Even though Zach had prepared 14 different types and over 200 kilos of freeze-dried vegetables, in the end, they just didn't taste the same as the fresh ones. The same thing happened with the frozen meat, which was losing its appeal. The 3 older adults began to lose their appetites quite noticeably. We reached day 40 of the outbreak. For the first time, a presenter appeared on the provincial channel. Judging by the background, he seemed to be in a transit studio. But the broadcast was clearly improvised. To be honest, the green screen effect wasn't even stable. The good news was that the first safe zone in the province had finally been established. This safe zone was located in the southern mountains, in what used to be a military training base. Just as the outbreak began, there were troops training right there. Once the soldiers realized the scale of the disaster, they established the safe zone immediately. After chaotically repelling the first waves of zombie attacks, the troops finally began to take the initiative and regain control. In the midst of the outbreak, an incredible proximity was observed. Forces rose up with strength, focusing on urban areas and the desire to push back the tides of the infected from the main alliances. By the time the day ended, they had finished setting up projects in the sector to secure the land. We see that they had enough provisions, solid defenses, and a reliable escape plan. There was simply no need to risk everything by heading to the safe zone. Deep down, they knew it was much better to stay in the shelter. Suddenly, Zach's wife raised a very good question in that moment. Surely there couldn't be many people left who could still watch television like they did. Who exactly were these news reports for? Her father slapped his forehead in realization. He muttered that he was getting old, far too old for this. He had completely forgotten about the existence of the radio. The radio had surely been broadcasting information for a long time now. They all stood there looking at each other, not knowing what to say. To be honest, it hadn't occurred to any of them to prepare one. His mother pulled one of those Bluetooth speakers used for dancing in the park from her bag. The radio function on this particular device had broken a long time ago. It only worked with Bluetooth, but he decided to take it apart to see what was wrong. Our story continues as Zach's father-in-law pulled out a screwdriver and pried open the device's casing. It turned out a capacitor had burned out, a very common type, as it happens. He noted that they simply needed to scavenge one from another small household appliance. Without a second thought, he began taking apart a nearby massager to find the part. He found the capacitor and swapped it out, and by the time the repair was finished, night had already fallen. With the radio finally functional again, Zach began to slowly scan through the national stations, searching for any sign of life. Surprisingly, there was everything and yet nothing at all on the airwaves. Static filled the room. There was nothing, and then more of nothing, stretching across the dial. Station after station yielded only silence, until finally, he found a broadcast with the same repetitive message. The voice announced that there were safe zones established in various specific locations. The recording urged survivors to head toward them according to their own circumstances. To be honest, the father-in-law's repair job was surprisingly effective. The device wasn't just picking up the standard commercial radio stations anymore. It even managed to catch the tactical signals from the local military airport. Suddenly, an idea occurred to Zach as he listened to the static. He searched his phone and found the channel of a radio enthusiast from the north he'd met once. It was the frequency belonging to Dan, a dedicated amateur radio hobbyist. He attempted to tune in, but was met with the sudden, jarring sound of a massive zombie horde. The noise gave him such a fright he nearly jumped as a muffled voice struggled to be heard. The voice on the other end was full of panic, screaming that there were simply too many zombies. They were described as a literal tide, an endless sea of the dead with no visible end in sight. This massive wave of the lost was apparently surging down from the north. Zach remembered that Dan lived in the north, which made the news even more chilling. The man was over 1,300 kilometers away, yet the danger felt uncomfortably close. If there were people even further north than him, it meant the threat might be coming from across the border. His sister-in-law stepped closer, noting that zombies are less active in low temperatures. That was why they were migrating south, proving they still possessed some primitive biological instincts. Zach's wife then asked a question that made everyone pause. Could the zombies actually reproduce? It was just like her to come up with one of her wild, slightly terrifying ideas. He thought about it for a moment before pulling his wife back into the other room. From his collection of study materials, he pulled out a specific film to show her. As she watched, the color drained from her face in complete disgust. To be honest, even Zach felt a bit nauseous looking at the footage himself. They returned to the living room, where his sister-in-law showed them a piece of paper. Based on the movement speed of the zombie they had seen below earlier, she calculated that it had covered 200 meters in just 3 minutes. That averaged out to approximately 4 kilometers per hour. It was slightly slower than a person's walking pace, which was a small mercy. This was likely because the sun was beating down on them during the day. It seemed they feared the sunlight, and based on her notes, they likely only walked a maximum of 8 hours a day. To cover a distance of 1,300 kilometers, it would take them roughly 40 days. And that was assuming they had to navigate through cities, cross rivers, and climb through ravines. Not to mention the constant need to find places to hide from the scorching sun. Zach realized then why he hadn't encountered any zombies during the initial testing phase. Thanks to the heavy downpour a few days prior, the solar panels were now sparkling clean. As a result, the energy generation over the last few days had been remarkably high. The power levels were surging, consistently reaching over 80 kilowatt-hours per day. Furthermore, since no suspicious sounds had leaked out over the past month, they decided to lift the noise restrictions and return to a sense of normalcy, simply because they now had more electricity than they knew what to do with. The first harvest of hydroponic vegetables was a resounding success, and the issue of the elders' lack of appetite was finally beginning to improve. However, the biggest surprise came from the chickens Zach had bought from the old farmer. To be honest, he had acted on a bit of a whim when he purchased the entire cage. There were 16 in total, 15 hens and one very busy rooster. His original plan, quite simply, was to use them as a source of fresh meat. Who would have thought they would actually start laying eggs so soon? But this unexpected bounty brought with it an immediate and practical problem. Their food consumption increased significantly. After all, a laying hen is a hungry hen. The truth was, they hadn't actually planned to stock up on chicken feed, nor had they prepared any basic grains for their feathered guests. After 5 days of observation, we see them reach a conclusion. If they kept all 16 chickens just for the eggs, their water reserves would still exceed 1,000,000 grams. If they allowed them to hatch chicks once every 6 months to replace the older layers, their timeline would be reduced by 3 months. After a democratic vote, it was finally decided to keep 9 of the 15 hens. The plan was simple. Let them hatch a new brood once every 9 months. We come to day 55 of the outbreak. Originally, this was the very day that, in his past life, Zack had lost all contact with his in-laws. Their houses had stood facing each other, separated only by the river. In that previous timeline, they could still use flashlight signals to let each other know they were safe. Until, one day, there was no answer. But now, the entire family is gathered together inside the shelter. Though they cannot see the sunlight, the family is finally safe and sound. So they decided to organize a grand feast to mark the occasion. They celebrated with the drinks and fine liquors they had carefully treasured. They even had desserts and ice pops to go around. Eventually, Zack and his father-in-law sat down together to talk. After carefully evaluating their safety and taking strict fire precautions, together, they prepared skewers and grilled lamb ribs for the feast. They were in the middle of their meal when the usual television broadcast flickered and the news studio appeared with a presenter delivering an urgent emergency bulletin. Several zombie hordes coming from the north had already wiped out multiple small safe zones and settlements in the northern provinces, causing a staggering number of deaths. And in the end, there was nothing to be done. The horde had only grown stronger. Currently, the mass of undead continues to advance south at a speed of 3 to 5 kilometers per hour. Naturally, everyone stopped eating immediately. We see in the footage how the zombies, using their sheer numerical superiority, crowded together at the very edges of the safe zones. Bit by bit, they piled on top of each other until they reached the height of the walls, finally climbing over to enter the safe zone and begin a massacre. It was now the 70th day since the horde had first begun its deadly march. After witnessing the horde's method of attack, we see a shift in their priorities. Zack and his father-in-law meticulously inspected their entire defense system, paying special attention to the platform where the destroyed staircase used to be. To prevent the zombies from stacking themselves high enough to climb inside, he used the remaining cement to turn the platform into a steep incline. This way, the zombies would find it impossible to keep their footing. Fortunately, the day also brought a bit of good news. The first batch of quail eggs was successfully sorted within the safe zone. This small victory means that our plan for a sustainable meat supply has taken a massive step forward. We have now reached day 90 of the outbreak. According to the news, the vanguard of the massive zombie horde heading south halted its advance 10 days ago due to the rising temperatures. Yet more undead continue to merge into the main group, swelling its ranks. Currently, the horde has settled to the north, over 400 kilometers away, occupying the banks of the Great Ebb River. Over the past few months, we see more safe zones appearing across the landscape. The nearest one is located only 50 kilometers from our position. However, one can't help but notice that while these small zones struggle to raise higher walls, they likely won't hold for long against such a horde. After 3 months of constant use, the bottom of the sewage tank has already accumulated a rather considerable amount of solid waste. It happens to be raining today, so, using the weather as a convenient cover, the plan is to completely drain the tank and start fresh. The accumulated sludge will also be extracted through the bottom drainage outlet. Since they now have an excess of electricity, they even brought out all the heaters. They intend to dry out the moisture, compress the waste into blocks, and stack them in the solid waste area. The entire family donned their protective suits and respirators. His wife kept a close watch on the monitors, the dog, and the cats. The rest of the group headed to the tank to get to work. First, they completely emptied out the sewage tank. Next, they used the upper drainage outlet of the wastewater tank to give it a quick rinse. After disinfecting and soaking the sewage tank 8 times, they opened the lower drainage outlet of the wastewater tank to begin emptying it. This was the most tense moment as they moved slowly to the drainage outlet. It took them about an hour to drain all the water. He checked with his wife, who noted the zombies were taking shelter from the rain. At the main entrance, the drain at the bottom of the tank is more complicated. On one hand, there are sediments and the height is quite low, so it cannot be connected directly to the main drainage pipe. On the other hand, they fear too many solids might clog the pipes, which is why this specific drainage outlet remains open. They performed a quick check of the drainage outlet to ensure everything was ready. They double-checked that the 2 doors separating the drain from the living area were shut. He and his father-in-law pushed a wheelbarrow carrying a stainless steel tank of 150 liters. His mother-in-law controlled the drain valve. His mother was in charge of catching any stray drips, using a small basin once the tank was finally filled. His sister-in-law was in charge of operating the compressor. By then, we see they had already turned off the ozone generator. Everything was ready, and the valve was finally opened. A black, viscous substance emerged, looking uncomfortably like half-melted chocolate. Even though his respirator was working at full capacity, he realized that it is simply impossible to completely block out a stench like that. He joked they should just buy a new car. He and his father-in-law closed the valve tightly. They used all their strength to drag the heavy cart toward the solid waste treatment room. They turned off the UV lamp and opened the door, confirming the ozone concentration wouldn't affect the treatment. The valve opened, releasing more of that dark, sludge-like substance. They secured the valve properly and entered the compression cubicle to begin. Inside the solid waste compactor channel, they placed several layers of fiber cloth. Underneath the machine, they intentionally placed a large tub to catch the dirty water that would leak during compression. He and his father-in-law, spoonful by spoonful, scooped out the sticky mud. They poured it into the compression channel, filling it up to about 80% capacity. They covered it with fiber cloth, started the motor, and moved the compression plate gradually into its starting position. The compression began. Since they were afraid of tearing the fiber cloth, the descent speed was kept slow and the pressure remained gentle. Normally, compressing waste takes a mere 20 seconds, but for them, it took a full 2 minutes. In the end, the sludge was transformed into a flat plate, or a sheet, one might say. He mused that if they wrote something on it and it was found in a few hundred years, it would surely count as a historical document. A rather unpleasant one, to be honest. His father-in-law's laughter could be heard echoing through the respirator. It sounded a bit muffled, but he couldn't help but join in the laughter himself. Imagine future scientists studying what the plate was made of. They'd likely vomit on the spot. And then, naturally, they would be accused of destroying a priceless cultural relic. Between the jokes and the banter, we see them stacking the sludge plates one by one. Once the compression was finished, they brought in 2 electric heaters to finish the job. Taking advantage of their surplus electricity, they worked tirelessly to compress every last bit. They repeated the process over and over, hurrying to get every single plate dried out. Otherwise, the stench would linger, and the plates would remain a serious biological hazard. On the 150th day after the outbreak, the temperature finally began to drop. This sudden chill wasn't exactly a surprise to anyone in the shelter. After all this time, the government had already restored some social functions in the safe zones, including the weather forecast, which was a small but welcome return to normalcy. It was, in fact, one of the very first public services to be reinstated. To be perfectly honest, the change in temperature was barely felt inside the shelter. After all, good thermal insulation works just as well for the cold as it does for the heat. Inside, the cultivation area remained warm and humid, bathed in abundant artificial light. The hydroponic plants were growing with impressive exuberance, especially those known for their rapid growth, such as the lettuce and the chives. By this point, we see that they had already managed to harvest several times. And just as they were finding a bit of joy in farming and raising their chickens, someone suddenly shouted through the headset, "There's trouble, come quickly." Returning to the living room, the voice of Toby could be heard crackling over the radio. With a voice bordering on panic, he said they had returned. And there were more than last time, all of them outsiders, apparently. There were so many of them, in fact, that they no longer fit in the streets. Throughout the following week, they spent their time listening to Toby's channel. He described the massive size of the zombie nest, clearly worried about being unable to go out and search for food. They heard him calculating exactly how much longer his supplies would last. Meanwhile, on the television, a new announcement was made. The government declared they would destroy the bridges with airstrikes to cut off the migration route of the zombie horde heading south. The plan was to annihilate the horde once they concentrated on the north bank of the river. During the next 50 days, moving from the far north of the country toward the south, every few days, news would arrive that another bridge had been destroyed in this place or that, or perhaps that another massive horde of zombies had finally been eliminated. Day 220 of the outbreak had finally arrived. The temperature was steadily dropping, now hovering dangerously close to 0 degrees. In response, we see them checking every water pipe and all the heating equipment to prevent everything from freezing and eventually bursting. They also prepared themselves to keep the water running continuously as a precaution. As for their hydroponic crops, they harvested as much as they possibly could. The plants that clearly weren't going to survive the cold were all gathered together. They installed a circulation pump to create a constant, steady flow of water. Meanwhile, the massive zombie horde had already begun to move again. They reached the center of the country, where the network of rivers is incredibly dense. These rivers split the horde into fragments, reducing their size and limiting their movement. The freezing temperatures also forced the zombies to move much more slowly. The combination of all these factors made this specific region the perfect environment to finally eliminate them. The north of the country was now covered in snow. With the cities locked down, the few zombies that remained scattered there, those who hadn't migrated south, were simply no match for the army. So, in practice, one could say the apocalypse had already ended for the north. Reconstruction had already begun, though the situation in the south was quite different. The zombies there continued migrating south because the local forces lacked the capacity to stop them. This brief window for the zombies to leave the country was quickly seized by the leaders. They destroyed the bridges to prevent the zombies from our country from continuing toward Nanjing, and also to cut off, quite effectively, any possible route back to the north. Of course, we know that our country's borders aren't just made of rivers. Because of that, some of the destroyed bridges are south of the border, and the government of China didn't object. If there is even anything left to be said at this point, our protagonist, Jake, could say with pride that the preparations he made for this apocalypse were never unnecessary. We fast forward to day 435 after the initial outbreak. Order in both the north and the south has finally become practically stable. It can be said with absolute certainty that the zombies have been eliminated. Those remaining in the central region are also being liquidated little by little. He felt that it wouldn't be much longer before they were finally rescued. However, the news reports today mention something quite concerning. In their specific area, BC, no survivors have been found in the last 100 days. No new distress signals have been received from that sector either. Therefore, to wipe out the zombie horde once and for all, the government has decided that in 10 days, they will drop bait in the rivers near BC. The plan is to concentrate the local zombies in BC and eliminate them quickly with a nuclear weapon. The nuclear weapon they plan to use is small, powerful, and has low residual radiation. It was developed independently by our country's scientists, who, naturally, hold all the intellectual property rights to the device. We see them all standing there, staring at one another in utter disbelief. A concentrated cleanup of their home, BC, using a nuclear weapon. A weapon? Deep down, they knew that would make their situation much worse. They wondered what was happening and how everything could just be blown to pieces. It seemed that for the crime of hiding too well, they had earned a nuclear bomb. He questioned if this place could even withstand such a blast, which, naturally, it couldn't. Jake told the others to stop overthinking and start packing. It was time to leave. The two cars were always ready, even though they hadn't been used in a year. According to the gauges, however, they were still in perfect working condition. Jake and his father-in-law sat down to discuss their next move. They decided they couldn't just leave without a proper plan in place. First, if they left, the shelter had to remain completely sealed. That way, if reconstruction ever began, they might be able to recover their belongings. Second, they needed to eat a hearty meal before departing to ensure they had enough strength and energy to face any unexpected trouble on the road. Third, their new destination would be a designated safe zone. Fourth, although that zone had a rationing system, there was a silver lining. Any supplies they brought with them wouldn't be confiscated, they would remain theirs. Fifth, while currency was still in circulation, carrying large amounts of cash was difficult. They needed something of real value to use for bartering along the way. They decided to take every seed they hadn't planted yet, along with all the quails. Even the eggs were included, all carefully hard-boiled for the journey. Sixth on the list, one car would be dedicated entirely to carrying their basic food staples. Seventh, a supply of meat, and eighth, every variety of bean to serve as future seeds. Ninth, the explosives they had manufactured earlier, divided into neat 200-gram packets. 10th, they allocated 2 kilograms per car for self-defense, just in case, of course. 11th, they packed away bags of canned vegetables. 12th, a massive collection of various hot sauces, totaling 120 kilograms. These were stored securely in the cage mounted on the outside of the car. 13th, each person was allotted 3 changes of clothes and 10 sets of undergarments. And finally, they gathered the battery packs. They would be distributing the battery packs for the first time as they organized their gear. To them, the equipment was what made the team, but survival depended on these future supplies. Before leaving, however, they had to deal with the zombie lingering in the complex. If they didn't, it would surely interfere with their final preparations. As it turned out, the solution to their problem was quite simple. They placed a chicken in the elevator as bait and waited for the creature to enter. Once it was inside, they shut the door and promptly cut the power. It worked perfectly. The flapping chicken drew the zombie in without a second thought. The moment it stepped inside, they hit the button from the 4th floor to seal it in. The moment the elevator began its ascent, they cut the power immediately. The very next thing they heard was the terrifying screech of the chicken. On the monitor, we see the zombie finish its meal before pacing aimlessly inside its new cage. To be absolutely certain the area was safe, they released 3 more chickens outside. After the birds wandered the complex for a full day and night, and seeing they were still alive and well, the team finally donned their protective suits. They descended to the 1st floor via the other elevator and began dismantling the false wall. Just as they finished, the day arrived when the government intended to deploy various decoys to lure the zombies out of the city. On the monitors, we see a military drone flying low and slow over the city streets, occasionally dropping live animals to get the creature's attention. At other times, it blasted loud music to draw the zombies from every corner. While the horde was being lured north, our survivors launched their own drone for the first time. High in the air, their small craft crossed paths with the military drone as it was returning to its base, and the two machines briefly met. On the second day, during a shift change, the military drone dropped a small package at the exact location where they had first encountered one another. They retrieved it using their own drone and carefully brought it back to the complex. After disinfecting it several times, they found a military walkie-talkie and a letter inside. The first part of that letter confirmed the exact hour the war would begin. The second part of the letter confirmed the exact hour the war would begin, while the third detailed the evacuation route and the meeting point. The next section focused on the strict quarantine protocols and the necessary disinfection requirements. The third part discussed the safe zone, the protection of personal property, and provided an explanation of how job assignments would work under the new rationing system. Finally, the last part of the letter listed the supplies that were urgently needed within the safe zone. After reading the letter, Ryan was struck by a new idea. Aside from keeping their essential belongings, he realized the rest of their hoard could be shared entirely with the government in exchange for a bit of special treatment. After all, in their family, only 3 people were capable of hard labor, and they had 3 elderly members to care for. Obviously, that wasn't an advantage in a world governed by strict rationing. After negotiating with the government officials, they agreed that all their electrical appliances, batteries, and car parts would remain theirs. The rest of the supplies would be split down the middle, on the condition that the 3 seniors wouldn't have to work and would still receive the same rations and care as everyone else. Furthermore, the government promised to send troops to collect them and help transport their remaining supplies, and so they waited for 2 days. On the second day after the zombies were cleared out, we see a convoy of vehicles approaching on the monitors, flying a military flag full of glory and pride. In that moment, Ryan knew his long struggle to survive the apocalypse had finally reached a successful end.